The mirror showed 7 scars, each one a memory Jennifer Lewis wished she could forget. The largest ran from her left temple to her jaw, a jagged reminder of the carriage accident that had claimed her parents and left her face forever changed. The others were smaller but no less permanent, scattered across her cheek and neck like cruel punctuation marks in a story she never wanted to tell. She pressed her fingers against the glass, watching her reflection waver in the lamplight of her small room above the general store in Cedar Ridge. 23 years old and already considered a spinster by the townspeople who whispered behind their hands when she passed. Not that she blamed them. What man would want a woman whose face told such ugly stories? The wind howled outside her window, carrying the first bite of winter down from the mountains. October in Colorado Territory meant harsh weather was coming, and with it, the isolation that would trap her in this small town with people who saw her scars before they saw her, if they saw her at all. A sharp knock at her door made her jump. Jennifer quickly pulled her shawl up to cover the worst of the scarring and opened the door to find George Foster, the store owner, standing in the hallway with his hat in his hands. "Miss Lewis," he said, not quite meeting her eyes, "I need to speak with you." Her heart sank. She had been expecting this conversation for weeks, ever since she had overheard George talking to his wife about how business was slow and they could not afford to keep paying her wages. The scars made customers uncomfortable, his wife had said. People preferred to shop elsewhere. "Of course, Mr. Foster. Please come in." George stepped into her small room, looking around at the few possessions she had managed to accumulate in her 3 years working for him. A trunk with her clothes, a few books, the mirror that showed her too much truth. Not much to show for a life, but it was hers. "Miss Lewis, you know I think highly of you. Your work has been excellent, and you have been nothing but reliable." The word but hung in the air between them, unspoken but understood. "However," George continued, "my wife feels that perhaps it would be best if we made some changes. The customers, you understand." Jennifer nodded, her throat tight. She understood perfectly. Her scars made people uncomfortable, reminded them that terrible things could happen to anyone. Better to keep such reminders out of sight. "I will pack my thing tonight, Mr. Foster. You do not need to explain further." George looked relieved that she was making this easy for him. "I will pay you through the end of the month, of course, and if you need a reference." "Thank you, that is very kind." After he left, Jennifer sat on her narrow bed and stared out the window at the mountains rising like dark teeth against the star-filled sky. Where would she go? What would she do? The few coins she had saved would not last long, and no other business in town would hire her if George Foster would not keep her. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you are watching from and hype this video in the comments. She had heard stories of women who went west to find work, but those were usually young, pretty women who could find husbands or work in saloons. Women without faces that frightened children and made grown men look away. Women who did not carry their tragedies written across their skin for all to see. The next morning dawned gray and cold, with snow threatening in the heavy clouds that pressed down on the valley. Jennifer packed her few belongings into her trunk and waited for the stage that would take her away from Cedar Ridge. She had decided to go to Denver, where she might disappear among the crowds and find some kind of work that did not require her to face customers. The stage was late, delayed by the weather, and Jennifer waited on the wooden platform outside the general store with her trunk beside her. Other passengers gathered slowly, a traveling salesman with a case full of patent medicines, an older woman visiting her daughter, a young couple heading to their new homestead. They all gave Jennifer polite nods but kept their distance, their eyes sliding away from her scars. Tyler Garcia, the stage driver, loaded her trunk with the others and helped her into the coach. He was one of the few people in town who had always treated her with simple kindness, never staring at her scars or acting as if they made her less than human. "Weather looks rough ahead, Miss Lewis," he said as he secured her trunk. "Might be a difficult journey." "I appreciate the warning, Mr. Garcia." The stage lurched into motion, wheels creaking over the rutted road that led out of Cedar Ridge and into the mountains. Jennifer pressed herself into the corner of the coach and watched the familiar buildings fall away behind them. She had lived in this town for 3 years, but she felt no sadness at leaving. There had been no real life for her here, only existence. The road climbed steadily into the mountains, winding through stands of aspen and pine that were already touched with autumn gold. The air grew thinner and colder as they gained elevation, and Jennifer pulled her coat tighter around herself. The other passengers dozed or made quiet conversation, but she remained alert, watching the wild country roll past outside the window. They had been traveling for 2 hours when the first snowflakes began to fall, fat and heavy, sticking to the windows of the coach. Tyler called down from the driver's seat that they would push on to the next way station, but the weather was worsening quickly. Jennifer could feel the tension in the coach as the snow grew heavier and the wind began to howl through the mountain passes. The traveling salesman kept checking his pocket watch and muttering about schedules. The young couple held hands and spoke in whispers about whether they should have waited for better weather. The stage began to struggle as the snow accumulated on the road. Jennifer could hear Tyler shouting encouragement to the horses, could feel the wheels slipping and sliding on the increasingly treacherous surface. Through the window, she could see nothing but white, the world erased by the storm. Then the coach lurched violently to one side, throwing the passengers against each other. Jennifer heard Tyler cursing, heard the horses screaming, and then the world turned upside down as the stage rolled off the road and down the steep mountainside. Jennifer hit her head against the window frame and felt warm blood running down her face, adding new pain to her old scars. The coach rolled twice before coming to rest against a stand of pine trees, the sound of splintering wood and groaning metal echoing through the storm. For a moment, there was only silence and the whisper of falling snow. Then the moaning began. The traveling salesman was unconscious, blood seeping from a gash on his forehead. The older woman was crying, holding her arm at an unnatural angle. The young couple clung to each other, the woman sobbing while her husband tried to calm her. Jennifer pulled herself upright, testing her limbs for serious injury. Her head throbbed and she could taste blood, but nothing seemed broken. She was alive, which was more than she had expected when the coach began to roll. Quote 12, she called out, but there was no answer from the driver's seat. She managed to force open the damaged door of the coach and climbed out into the storm. The snow was already ankle-deep and falling harder, driven by a wind that cut through her coat like a knife. She could barely see 10 feet in any direction. Tyler Garcia lay motionless in the snow 20 feet from the overturned coach, thrown clear when the stage rolled. Jennifer stumbled through the drifts to reach him, falling to her knees beside his still form. His neck was bent at an impossible angle, his eyes staring sightlessly at the falling snow. He was dead. Their driver, their guide through these mountains of pins, was dead. Jennifer looked back at the overturned coach, at the injured passengers trapped inside, then up at the mountains that surrounded them like prison walls. They were miles from the nearest settlement, trapped in a blizzard with no shelter except the damaged stagecoach, no food except what little the passengers might have brought, and no way to signal for help. The storm showed no signs of letting up. If anything, it was getting worse, the wind howling like a living thing as it drove the snow into drifts that would soon bury the coach entirely. They would freeze to death out here, all of them, unless someone found them soon. But who would look for them in this weather? The next stage was not due for 3 days, and by then they would be buried under feet of snow, just another tragedy in these unforgiving mountains. Jennifer wiped the blood from her new cut and felt the familiar sting of damaged skin. 7 scars she had carried into the storm. Soon she might have an 8th if she lived long enough for it to heal. She made her way back to the coach where the other passengers were trying to organize themselves despite their injuries. The young man, who introduced himself as Thomas Green, had managed to help his wife Jessica out of the overturned coach. Jessica was unhurt except for bruises, but she was in shock, shivering uncontrollably despite the coat her husband had wrapped around her. The older woman, who said her name was Cynthia Reed, had definitely broken her arm, but she was trying to be brave about it. The traveling salesman, Douglas Richardson, had regained consciousness, but seemed confused and kept asking where they were. "The driver is dead," Jennifer told them quietly. "We are on our own." The words hit them like physical blows. Thomas Green went pale and pulled his wife closer. Cynthia Reed closed her eyes and whispered what might have been a prayer. Douglas Richardson just stared at her as if he had not understood. "What do we do?" Jessica Green asked, her voice barely audible over the wind. Jennifer looked around at the group. "An injured older woman?" A confused man with a head injury, a young couple with no experience of survival, and herself, not exactly a promising group for surviving in the wilderness. "We need shelter," she said. "The coach will have to do for now, but we need to get it upright if we can, or at least make it more stable." Thomas Green nodded, seeming grateful for someone to take charge. "I can help with that. What else?" "We need to inventory what supplies we have. Food, water, blankets, anything that might help us survive until rescue comes." If rescue came, she thought but did not say. They worked together to right the coach, which proved impossible with their limited strength and the injured among them. Instead, they managed to wedge it more securely against the trees and clear out the interior so they could all fit inside. It was cramped and cold, but it was better than being exposed to the storm. Their supplies were meager. Douglas Richardson had a few bottles of his patent medicine and some crackers. The Greens had a small sack of dried fruit and some jerky. Cynthia Reed had knitting supplies and a thermos of coffee that was still warm. Jennifer had only the few coins in her purse and a small loaf of bread she had brought for the journey. It was not enough. Not nearly enough for 5 people to survive for days in a mountain blizzard. As night fell, the temperature dropped even further, and the wind grew more vicious. They huddled together in the overturned coach, sharing what warmth they could, but Jennifer could feel the cold seeping through the damaged walls and broken windows. Jessica Green had stopped shivering, which Jennifer knew was a bad sign. The young woman was going into hypothermia, her body shutting down to conserve heat. Thomas held his wife desperately, trying to share his warmth, but he was not much better off. Douglas Richardson had fallen asleep, or perhaps unconscious again. His breathing was shallow and irregular. Cynthia Reed sat with her broken arm cradled against her chest, her lips moving in silent prayer. Jennifer pressed her back against the side of the coach and stared out through the broken window at the swirling snow. This was how it would end then. Not in some dramatic fashion, but slowly, quietly, as the cold crept into their bones and stole their lives one breath at a time. She thought about the scars on her face, about the story each one told. The carriage accident that had killed her parents and marked her forever. The fall from a horse when she was 12. The burn from a cooking fire when she was learning to take care of herself. Each scar a moment when she had survived something that should have killed her. But this would be the end of her story. No more scars to collect, no more survival against the odds. Just a slow fade into the white silence of the storm. The sound came just before dawn, so faint at first that Jennifer thought she was imagining it. A rhythmic thudding, barely audible over the wind. She pressed her ear to the side of the coach and listened, afraid to hope. There it was again. Footsteps in the snow, deliberate and steady, coming closer. "Someone is out there," she whispered to the others. Thomas Green stirred, his wife still unconscious in his arms. "Are you sure?" Before Jennifer could answer, a shadow passed by the broken window of the coach. Then a voice, deep and rough, called out through the storm. "Anyone alive in there?" Jennifer's heart leaped. There was a pause, then the sound of movement outside the coach. Jennifer could see a dark figure moving through the snow, too indistinct to make out clearly, but definitely human. Their rescuer was real. A gloved hand appeared at the window, then a face. Jennifer found herself looking into the bluest eyes she had ever seen, set in a weathered face framed by dark hair and a thick beard. The man was older than her, maybe 30, with a kind of deep tan that came from years spent outdoors. He said, Jennifer said, quote 29. Lionel looked past her at the injured passengers. His expression was grim, but determined. Quote 30. He was right, Jennifer knew. They were already dying. Slowly but surely. This stranger was their only hope, she asked. Lionel disappeared into the storm, leaving Jennifer to rouse the others and explain the situation. Thomas Green was eager to go, desperate to get help for his wife. Cynthia Reed was willing to try, despite her broken arm. Douglas Richardson was barely coherent, but he nodded when Jennifer explained they were leaving. Jessica Green was the problem. The young woman was unconscious and barely breathing, her lips blue with cold. Moving her in this weather could kill her, but staying would definitely kill her. Lionel returned with a makeshift sled fashioned from pine branches and rope. He had also brought additional blankets and a thermos of hot coffee that steamed in the frigid air. Quote 33, he said, looking at Jessica. Quote 34, he helped Thomas load his unconscious wife onto the sled, wrapping her in blankets and securing her with rope. Then he shouldered his pack and took hold of the rope that would pull the sled. Quote 35, he ordered. Quote 36. They all nodded, even Douglas Richardson managing to focus long enough to comprehend the seriousness of their situation. Lionel set off into the storm, pulling the sled behind him with Jessica Green bundled on it like a package. Jennifer fell in line behind him, followed by Thomas, then Cynthia, then Douglas, bringing up the rear. The journey was a nightmare. The snow was knee-deep in places, and the wind drove it into their faces with stinging force. Jennifer could barely see Lionel ahead of her, just a dark shape moving steadily through the white chaos. Her feet were numb with cold, and her face felt like it was being flayed by the wind, but she kept moving. Behind her, she could hear Thomas Green encouraging his wife, talking to her unconscious form as if his voice alone could keep her alive. Cynthia Reed was struggling with her broken arm, but she never complained, never asked to rest. Douglas Richardson stumbled and swayed, but somehow kept his feet. They climbed steadily upward, following what Jennifer hoped was a path, but looked like nothing more than a slightly less dense collection of trees. Lionel moved with the confidence of someone who knew these mountains intimately, never hesitating, never seeming to doubt his direction. After what felt like hours but was probably less than one, Jennifer began to smell smoke. Wood smoke, the most beautiful scent in the world at that moment. Then she saw a faint glow ahead, warm yellow light spilling from windows into the storm. Lionel's cabin was larger than she had expected, built of solid logs with a steep roof to shed snow. Smoke rose from a stone chimney, and the windows glowed with the promise of warmth and safety. Lionel pulled the sled right up to the front door and began untying Jessica Green. "Get inside, all of you. There is a fire going and hot food waiting." Jennifer stumbled through the door and into blessed warmth. The cabin was one large room with a stone fireplace at one end and a kitchen area at the other. The walls were lined with shelves holding books, tools, and supplies. Thick rugs covered the wooden floor, and oil lamps provided steady light. It was the most welcoming place Jennifer had ever seen. Lionel carried Jessica Green to a bed in the corner of the room and began working to warm her slowly, rubbing her hands and feet and wrapping her in heated blankets. Thomas hovered anxiously nearby, but Lionel was clearly experienced in treating hypothermia. "She will live," he said finally. But it was close. Another hour and we would have lost her. Cynthia Reed sat by the fire, cradling her broken arm. Lionel examined it carefully, his large hands surprisingly gentle. "Clean break," he said. "I can set it, but it will hurt." "Do what you must," Cynthia said. Lionel set her arm with quick, efficient movements, then fashioned a sling from strips of cloth. Cynthia bore it stoically, though Jennifer could see tears in her eyes. Douglas Richardson had collapsed into a chair by the fire and seemed to be sleeping, his breathing more regular now that he was warm. "You all need food and rest," Lionel said. "There is stew on the stove and coffee in the pot. Help yourselves." Jennifer ladled stew into bowls for everyone, marveling at the rich smell of meat and vegetables. When had she last eaten a proper meal? It seemed like days, though it had only been since yesterday morning. As they ate, Lionel moved around the cabin with quiet efficiency, checking on his patients, adding wood to the fire, preparing additional bedding. He was clearly used to taking care of himself and others in difficult circumstances. "You saved our lives," Thomas Green said when he could finally speak. "How can we ever thank you?" Lionel shrugged. "You would have done the same for me." Jennifer was not so sure about that. How many people would have ventured out into a blizzard to rescue strangers? How many would have had the skill and knowledge to find them and bring them to safety? "How did you know we were there?" she asked. "Heard the crash yesterday evening. Was planning to look for survivors when the storm let up, but then I heard voices on the wind this morning." He made it sound simple, but Jennifer could imagine how difficult it must have been to locate them in the storm, to navigate through the blizzard with nothing but sound to guide him. As the day wore on, the storm outside continued to rage, but inside the cabin, they were warm and safe. Jessica Green regained consciousness and was able to take some broth. Douglas Richardson seemed more alert, though he still complained of headaches. Cynthia Reed rested with her arm properly set and splinted. Jennifer found herself watching their rescuer as he went about his tasks. Lionel Reed was unlike any man she had ever met. He was clearly strong and capable, but there was a gentleness in the way he cared for the injured. He spoke little, But when he did, his words were thoughtful and precise, and he had not once stared at her scars or looked away from them in discomfort. He treated her exactly the same as the others, as if her damaged face was nothing remarkable. As evening approached, Lionel prepared sleeping arrangements for his unexpected guests. The cabin had only one bed, which he gave to Jessica Green, still weak from her ordeal. He made pallets on the floor for the others, using thick blankets and furs that were surprisingly comfortable. "Where will you sleep?" Jennifer asked. "I will keep watch tonight. Make sure the fire does not go out and that everyone stays warm." "You must be exhausted. You have been taking care of us all day." Lionel looked at her with those penetrating blue eyes. "I am used to staying awake. Sleep when you can. Tomorrow we will assess the situation and decide what to do next." Jennifer lay on her pallet near the fire, listening to the storm howl outside and the quiet breathing of the other survivors. She should have been exhausted, should have fallen asleep immediately after the ordeal they had been through. Instead, she found herself watching Lionel as he moved quietly around the cabin, checking on his patients, adjusting the fire, reading by lamplight. There was something about this man that intrigued her. He lived alone in this remote cabin, far from any town or settlement. What had brought him here? What kept him here? And why had he risked his life to save strangers? She must have dozed, because when she opened her eyes again, the cabin was darker and quieter. The storm still raged outside, but it seemed less violent than before. Lionel sat in a chair by the fire, a book open in his lap, but he was looking at her. "Could not sleep?" he asked quietly. Jennifer sat up, pulling a blanket around her shoulders. "Too much to think about, I suppose." "You have been through a great deal." She touched her face unconsciously, feeling the familiar ridges of scar tissue. "More than you know." Lionel was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Scars tell stories. Some people are afraid of stories." Jennifer looked at him in surprise. It was the first time anyone had ever spoken about her scars without pity or discomfort. "What stories do you think mine tell?" she asked. "Survival, strength, the will to keep going when others would give up." His words hit her like a physical blow. No one had ever described her scars that way. They were ugly reminders of pain and loss, marks that made her unmarriageable and unemployable. But Lionel saw something different in them. "You do not know what you are talking about," she said, but without anger. "Do I not?" He closed his book and leaned forward. "You were in a carriage accident, lost someone important to you, probably your family." Jennifer stared at him. "How could you possibly know that?" "The largest scar across your cheek, that is from broken glass, probably a window. The pattern suggests you were thrown against it with considerable force. The smaller scars are from the same incident, fragments of glass. The way you carry yourself, the sadness in your eyes when you think no one is looking. You lost people you loved." She was speechless. He had read her story and her scars as easily as reading the book in his lap. "The other scars are older," he continued. "You learned to take care of yourself after the accident. Cooking burns, falls, the small injuries that come from learning to be independent. You have been alone for a long time." "Stop," she whispered. "You were leaving Cedar Ridge because they could not see past the scars to the person underneath. Going to Denver, hoping to disappear in the crowds. How do you know all this?" Lionel was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "Because I know what it is like to be marked by tragedy, to have people look at you and see only the damage." Jennifer studied his face in the firelight. She could see faint lines around his eyes, a small scar on his forehead mostly hidden by his hair. But nothing like the obvious damage that marked her. "I do not see any scars on you," she said. "All scars are visible." Before she could ask what he meant, Jessica Green stirred in the bed, murmuring her husband's name. Thomas was immediately at her side, and the moment between Jennifer and Lionel was broken. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the storm finally exhausted. Jennifer woke to the smell of coffee and bacon and the sound of Lionel moving quietly around the kitchen. Through the window she could see a world transformed by snow, everything clean and white and sparkling in the sunlight. The other survivors were stirring as well. Jessica Green was much improved, able to sit up and take solid food. Douglas Richardson seemed almost back to normal. His confusion cleared. Cynthia Reed was managing well with her broken arm. Lionel announced, Jennifer felt an unexpected pang of disappointment. She should have been relieved to be going back to civilization, to continue her journey to Denver. Instead, she found herself reluctant to leave this warm cabin and the man who had saved them. Quote 76. Thomas Green said, quote 77, quote 70. Lionel replied, quote 72. They spent the morning preparing for the journey back to the road. Lionel packed supplies and checked that everyone was strong enough for the walk. The snow was deep but manageable, and the weather was clear. As they prepared to leave, Jennifer found herself lingering, looking around the cabin that had been their sanctuary. It was a simple place, but there was something peaceful about it, something that spoke of a man who had found contentment in solitude. Quote 80, Lionel said quietly. Appearing beside her, Jennifer looked at him in surprise. It was true, but hearing it stated so baldly was painful. Quote to 83. Quote 80. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. Quote 85. Jennifer felt tears prick her eyes. The offer was tempting, more tempting than she wanted to admit. To stay in this peaceful place, to be seen as a person rather than a collection of scars. But it was impossible. Quote 86, she said. Quote 87, quote. Before she could answer, Thomas Green called that they were ready to go. Lionel shouldered his pack and led them out into the brilliant morning. The journey to the road took most of the day, but it was pleasant in the clear weather. The snow crunched under their feet, and the mountain air was crisp and clean. Jennifer found herself walking beside Lionel, matching his steady pace. She asked, he said, simply. He was quiet for so long she thought he would not answer. Then he said, quote 93, Jennifer understood that feeling all too well. They reached the main road as the sun was setting, painting the snow-covered peaks orange and gold. Lionel had cached supplies here, including a shelter where they could wait for the next stage. He said, setting down his pack. The other survivors gathered around to thank him again, pressing what little money they had on him as payment for his help. Lionel accepted it graciously, but Jennifer could tell he did not want it. As the others settled in for the night, Jennifer found herself alone with Lionel by the small fire he had built. Quote 95, she said quietly. Quote 96. Quote 97. Jennifer stared into the fire, wrestling with the decision. Stay with a stranger in the wilderness, or continue to Denver, where she would be just another lost soul in the crowd. She said. Lionel looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw something she had never seen before when someone looked at her. Not pity, not discomfort, not the desire to look away. Just acceptance. Quote 101, he said quietly. Quote 102, Jennifer felt her breath catch. No one had ever wanted to hear her stories before. They had only wanted to avoid them, to pretend they did not exist. Quote 103, she warned. Quote 101. In the distance, they could hear the sound of an approaching stage, the jingle of harness and the rumble of wheels on the frozen road. Soon she would have to make her choice. Get on that stage and continue to Denver, to a life of anonymity and loneliness. Or stay with this mysterious man who saw something in her scars that no one else ever had. The stage rounded the bend, its lanterns casting dancing shadows on the snow. The driver called out to them, and then the other survivors began gathering their belongings. Jennifer stood at the crossroads of her life, literally and figuratively, with the weight of decision heavy on her shoulders. Behind her lay everything she had known, a world that had no place for a scarred woman. Ahead lay uncertainty, but also the possibility of something she had never dared hope for. Acceptance. The stage pulled to a stop in front of them, and the driver jumped down to help the passengers aboard. Thomas Green helped his wife into the coach, followed by Cynthia Reed and Douglas Richardson. They all turned to look at Jennifer expectantly. Thomas asked. Jennifer looked at Lionel, who stood quietly beside the fire, his blue eyes reflecting the flames. He had made his offer. The choice was hers. The stage driver called impatiently for the last passenger. The horses stamped and snorted in the cold air, eager to be moving again. The other survivors waited, and Jennifer Lewis stood frozen between two worlds, her hand unconsciously touching the largest scar on her face, feeling the story it told of survival against impossible odds. The story that had brought her to this moment, to this choice, to this man who wanted to hear all 7 of her stories. But as she opened her mouth to speak, to make the decision that would determine the rest of her life, A new sound reached them through the clear mountain air. The distant howl of wolves, hungry and hunting, echoing off the peaks like a promise of danger to come. Lionel's head snapped up, his body tensing as he listened to the wild chorus. His hand moved instinctively to the rifle at his side, and his eyes scanned the dark tree line that surrounded their small circle of firelight. "Get in the stage," he said quietly, his voice carrying a new urgency. "Now, Tay." The wolves howled again, closer this time, their voices weaving through the mountain air like harbingers of death. Jennifer felt her blood turn to ice as she recognized the hunger in those wild calls. She had heard stories of wolf packs in these mountains, desperate creatures driven to hunt anything that moved when winter came early and prey grew scarce. "The stage," Lionel said again, his voice cutting through the night like a blade. "Everyone in the stage now." The driver, a grizzled man named Pete Morrison, was already reaching for the rifle mounted beside his seat. "How many you reckon?" he called down to Lionel. "Hard to say. At least 6, maybe more." Lionel's eyes never stopped scanning the tree line as he spoke. Quote 112. Thomas Green helped his wife Jessica into the coach with shaking hands. Quote 110, he asked. Quote 100. Lionel replied, but Jennifer caught the doubt in his voice. A stagecoach was not built to withstand a determined pack of hungry wolves. The canvas sides and wooden doors would not hold long against claws and teeth. Douglas Richardson climbed into the coach, his face pale in the lamplight. He asked Pete Morrison. The driver shook his head grimly. Cynthia Reed was the last to climb into the coach, favoring her broken arm. As Jennifer moved to follow her, Lionel caught her wrist gently. He said quietly. Jennifer nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She could see the concern in Lionel's blue eyes, the way his jaw was set with determination. He was afraid too, she realized, but he was not letting that fear control him. The howling came again, and this time Jennifer could hear individual voices in the chorus. 7 distinct calls, maybe 8. The pack was large, and they were communicating, coordinating their approach like the intelligent predators they were. Pete Morrison checked his rifle and counted his ammunition. Got maybe 20 rounds, he announced. What about you, Reed? Lionel patted the rifle slung across his shoulder. 15, plus a revolver with 6 shots. He looked at the nervous faces gathered around the fire. Anyone else armed? Thomas Green shook his head. I have a knife, but nothing more. I have a Derringer, Cynthia Reed said quietly from inside the coach. 2 shots. It was not enough, Jennifer thought, not nearly enough if the pack was as large as it sounded. Wolves were cunning hunters, and they would not attack directly into gunfire. They would wait, circle, probe for weakness, and eventually the ammunition would run out. A branch snapped in the darkness beyond the firelight, and everyone froze. Lionel raised his rifle, aiming at the sound, but nothing moved in the shadows between the trees. They are testing us, he said softly, seeing how we react. Jennifer pressed closer to the fire, feeling its warmth against her back. The flames danced and crackled, casting shifting shadows that made every tree trunk look like a crouching predator. Her scars ached in the cold air, each one a reminder of past pain, past survival against the odds. Another sound, this time from the opposite side of their small camp, a low growl, barely audible but unmistakably threatening. The horses hitched to the stage began to shift nervously, their eyes rolling white with fear. Easy, boys, Pete Morrison called to his team. Easy now. But the horses could smell what was coming. They stamped and snorted, pulling against their traces, ready to bolt if given the chance. If they broke free and ran, the travelers would be stranded here with no hope of escape. Lionel seemed to understand this as well. He moved quietly to the horses, speaking to them in low, soothing tones while keeping his rifle ready. Jennifer, he called softly, can you help calm them? Jennifer had grown up around horses before the accident that killed her parents. She knew how to speak their language, how to project calm, even when she felt none herself. She moved to the lead horse, a big bay gelding with intelligent eyes, and began stroking his neck. Easy, boy, she whispered. We are all afraid, but we will get through this. The horse's ears flicked toward her voice, and some of the tension went out of his frame. She continued talking, nonsense words that meant nothing but carried the tone of reassurance the animals needed. A shadow moved at the edge of the firelight, low to the ground and fluid as water. Jennifer caught just a glimpse of gray fur and yellow eyes before it melted back into the darkness. Quote when there she breathed, pointing. Lionel swung his rifle toward the spot, but the wolf was already gone. Quote when there, he said. Quote where'd he sick From inside the coach came the sound of quiet weeping. Jessica Green was crying softly, her husband murmuring words of comfort. The fear was infectious, spreading through the group like a plague. Quote 137. Douglas Richardson asked, his voice shaking. Pete Morrison consulted his pocket watch. 4 hours. Jennifer felt despair settle in her chest like a cold stone. Could they hold out that long against a pack of hungry wolves? Could their ammunition last? Could their nerves? The fire was burning lower now, and Lionel began adding more wood to the flames. The light pushed back the darkness a few more feet, but Jennifer knew it was a temporary reprieve. They had only so much fuel, and when it ran out, they would be at the mercy of creatures that knew no mercy. A horse screamed. The sound cut through the night like a knife, high and terrified and full of pain. One of Pete Morrison's team, the offside wheeler, was down, thrashing in the snow with something gray and snarling attached to its throat. Son of a bitch, Pete swore, raising his rifle. Do not shoot, Lionel commanded. You might hit the horse. But it was too late anyway. The wolf had done its work with surgical precision, opening the horse's jugular with one precise bite. Blood steamed black in the snow as the animal's struggles grew weaker. The other horses went wild with terror, rearing and plunging against their traces. The stage rocked violently as they tried to bolt, and Jennifer heard someone scream from inside the coach. Cut them loose, Lionel shouted to Pete, before they overturn the stage. Pete Morrison scrambled down from his seat, pulling a knife from his belt. But as he reached for the traces, 3 more wolves materialized from the darkness, moving with deadly purpose toward the remaining horses. Lionel's rifle cracked, and one of the wolves spun away with a yelp of pain. But the others kept coming, and Pete had to dive aside to avoid snapping jaws. The camp erupted into chaos, horses screaming, wolves snarling, people shouting in fear and confusion. Jennifer found herself pressed against the overturned stage, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst. Through the madness, she saw Lionel moving with calm precision, working the bolt of his rifle and taking careful aim. His second shot dropped another wolf, but more were emerging from the forest, gray shapes flowing like smoke between the trees. He yelled to Jennifer, a quote Wortbean, but as she turned toward the door, she saw something that made her blood freeze. A massive wolf, larger than the others, was stalking around the far side of the stage. Its yellow eyes were fixed on the opening where the passengers huddled inside. Quote 146, she screamed to the people in the coach. Thomas Green spun around just as the wolf launched itself through the doorway. He threw himself between the predator and his wife, catching the animal's weight against his chest. They went down together in a tangle of limbs and fury, Thomas's knife flashing as he fought for his life. Jennifer did not think. She grabbed a burning branch from the fire and lunged toward the struggling figures, thrusting the flame at the wolf's face. The animal yelped and pulled back, its fur singed, giving Thomas the opening he needed to drive his knife deep between its ribs. The wolf collapsed with a shuddering breath, its yellow eyes going dim. Thomas lay beneath it, gasping and bleeding from multiple claw marks, but alive. Thomas, Jessica cried, reaching for her husband. I am all right, he panted, just scratched up. But the attack had cost them. 2 horses were dead now, their blood soaking into the snow. The remaining animals had broken free and disappeared into the night, taking with them any hope of escape by stage. Pete Morrison stood over his fallen team with tears in his eyes. 20 years I have been driving these roads, he said. Never lost a horse to wolves before. Lionel reloaded his rifle with swift, economical movements. How many rounds left? He asked. 12, Pete replied. I have 10, Lionel said. He looked at the carnage around them, at the blood-stained snow and the yellow eyes still gleaming in the darkness beyond the fire. It is not enough. The pack had withdrawn after losing 2 of their number, but Jennifer could still hear them moving in the forest, low growls and the whisper of paws on snow. They were regrouping, planning their next attack, and next time they would not be caught off guard by rifle fire. What do we do now? Cynthia Reed asked from inside the coach. Her voice was steady, but Jennifer could hear the fear underneath. Lionel studied the terrain around them, his mind clearly working through possibilities. We need to get to higher ground, Eddie said finally. Somewhere we can defend from one direction only. Where? Pete Morrison asked. We are in the middle of nowhere. There is a rocky outcrop about half a mile north, Lionel said. If we can reach it, we can put our backs to stone and force them to come at us from the front. Half a mile through wolf-infested forest, Douglas Richardson said shakily. That is suicide. Staying here is suicide, Lionel replied. They know our position now, know our numbers and our weapons. They will wait for the fire to die down, then come at us from all sides. Jennifer looked at the dwindling pile of firewood. He was right. They had maybe an hour of good flame left, 2 at most. After that, they would be fighting in darkness against creatures that could see perfectly in the night. How do we move everyone? She asked. Jessica can barely walk, and Cynthia has a broken arm. We make travois, Lionel said. Drag poles with blankets stretched between them. Pete and I can pull them. What about the wolves? Thomas Green asked. He had torn strips from his shirt to bind his wounds, but blood was still seeping through the makeshift bandages. We move fast and quiet, stay together no matter what happens. If they attack, we form a circle and fight. It was a desperate plan, but Jennifer could see no alternative. They could not stay here, and they could not outrun a wolf pack on foot. Their only hope was to reach defensible ground before the predators worked up the courage for another assault. They worked quickly to fashion the travois, using branches from the forest and blankets from the coach. Jessica Green was loaded onto one, still weak from her ordeal in the blizzard. Cynthia Reed insisted she could walk, but they prepared a second travois just in case. As they worked, Jennifer found herself beside Lionel, helping him lash the poles together with strips of leather. You could have run, she said quietly. When the wolves first appeared, you could have slipped away in the darkness. Lionel looked at her with those penetrating blue eyes. Could I? Most men would have. I am not most men. Jennifer felt something warm unfurl in her chest despite the cold and the danger. This man, this stranger who lived alone in the mountains, was risking his life for people he barely knew. There was a nobility in that, a kind of honor she had rarely encountered. Why do you live up here, alone? She asked. What brought you to the mountains? Lionel was quiet for a moment, testing the strength of the lashings. Same thing that was taking you to Denver, he said finally, the need to disappear. Before Jennifer could ask what he meant, a long howl echoed through the forest. It was answered by another, then another, until the night was filled with the wild music of the pack. They are calling the others, Pete Morrison said grimly. Every wolf in these mountains will hear that. Lionel stood and shouldered his rifle. Then we need to move now. They formed a small procession in the dying firelight. Lionel took the lead, pulling Jessica Green's travois behind him. Pete Morrison followed, ready to help with Cynthia Reed if needed. Thomas Green walked beside his wife, one hand on his knife. Douglas Richardson and Jennifer brought up the rear, constantly watching the shadows for movement. The forest closed around them like a living thing, branches catching at their clothes and snow crunching under their feet with sounds that seemed impossibly loud. Jennifer's scars ached in the cold, each one a reminder of previous times she had faced death and somehow survived. They had gone perhaps a quarter mile when the first attack came. It was not a frontal assault but a probe, a single wolf darting in from the side to test their defenses. The animal came low and fast, aiming for Douglas Richardson's legs. Jennifer saw it coming and shouted a warning, swinging her makeshift torch at the creature's head. The wolf veered away from the flame but did not retreat far. It paced alongside them in the darkness, just beyond the reach of the torchlight, waiting for another opportunity. Keep moving, Lionel called back. Do not stop for anything. But more shapes were materializing from the forest now, gray shadows that flowed between the trees like smoke. The pack was growing bolder, sensing weakness in their prey's desperate flight. A second wolf rushed in from the left, this one going for Pete Morrison as he struggled with the travois. Pete dropped the poles and swung his rifle like a club, catching the animal across the skull with the stock. The wolf yelped and rolled away, but the travois overturned, spilling supplies into the snow. 187. Lionel commanded as Pete moved to right the makeshift sled. They pressed on, but their formation was beginning to break down. The constant harassment from the wolves was taking its toll, forcing them to move faster than the injured could manage. Jessica Green was semi-conscious, barely clinging to her travois that bounced over the rough ground. Thomas Green was struggling to keep up, his wounds bleeding freely. Jennifer found herself falling behind, her shorter legs unable to match the pace of the men. The wolves seemed to sense this, focusing their attention on her as the weakest member of the group. A large male, scarred from previous battles, began stalking her from the right side. Jennifer could see its yellow eyes fixed on her, could hear the low rumble of its growl. She waved her torch at it, but the flame was guttering, nearly spent. The wolf feinted left, then came in fast from the right. Jennifer threw herself aside, but her foot caught in a snow-covered root, and she went down hard. The torch flew from her hand, landing in a drift and hissing out. The wolf was on her in an instant, its weight driving her deeper into the snow. She felt its hot breath on her face, smelled the rank odor of its fur. Its jaws opened wide, revealing teeth like ivory daggers. Jennifer closed her eyes and waited for the pain. Instead, she heard the crack of a rifle and felt warm blood splash across her face. The wolf collapsed on top of her, its body going limp. Strong hands pulled the carcass away, and she found herself looking up into Lionel's concerned face. "Are you hurt?" he asked, helping her to her feet. Jennifer took inventory of herself, bruised, shaken, covered in wolf blood, but uninjured. "I'm all right." "Stay closer to me," he said, reloading his rifle. "We are almost there." The rocky outcrop loomed ahead of them, a jumble of granite boulders that rose 30 feet above the forest floor. It was not much, but it would give them something solid at their backs and force the wolves to attack uphill. They climbed as quickly as they could, hauling the travois and the injured up the steep slope. Jennifer's lungs burned in the thin air, and her legs trembled with exhaustion, but she kept climbing. Behind them she could hear the wolves following, their claws scrabbling on stone. The top of the outcrop was a small plateau, perhaps 20 feet across, with a sheer drop on 3 sides and a narrow approach from the forest below. It was as defensible a position as they were likely to find. Lionel quickly organized their defenses, positioning the men with rifles at the edge of the plateau, while the others tended to the injured. Jennifer helped Jessica Green down from the travois and wrapped her in blankets, trying to keep her warm. Lionel asked. Pete Morrison counted his ammunition. Quote, Marshal Lionel said, quote, 26, 19 shots. Jennifer did not need to be a military strategist to know it was not enough. She could see at least a dozen wolves moving through the trees below, their eyes reflecting the starlight, like malevolent stars. Quote, 27, Douglas Richardson said, his voice tight with fear. Quote, Winoid. Quote, Bayern, Lionel replied. Quote, 200 them. The first wolf appeared at the base of the slope, testing the approach. It was a large female, lean and scarred, clearly the pack's alpha. She studied the humans above her with intelligent eyes, calculating the odds. Lionel sighted down his rifle but did not fire. "Let them come closer," he said. "Make the shots count." The alpha wolf began to climb, moving with careful deliberation up the rocky slope. Others followed, spreading out to present multiple targets. They were learning, adapting their tactics to the terrain. "Now," Lionel said quietly. His rifle cracked, and the alpha wolf tumbled backward down the slope. Pete Morrison fired a split second later, dropping another animal. The rest of the pack scattered, disappearing into the shadows below. 17 shots left, Lionel said, reloading. Jennifer knew they could not keep this up for long. The wolves would probe and test, forcing them to expend ammunition until they had nothing left but knives and desperation. And then the real attack would come. She looked around the small plateau, searching for anything that might help their defense. There was not much, just the rocky ground and a few stunted pine trees that had somehow found purchase in the thin soil. "Pine trees. Lionel," she said suddenly, "the trees, we can use them for fire." He looked where she was pointing, understanding immediately. The pine boughs were thick with resin, perfect for burning. If they could create a barrier of flame around the edge of the plateau, it might keep the wolves at bay. "Good thinking," he said. "Thomas, Douglas, help me cut branches." They worked quickly, using knives to hack down the smaller trees and strip them of their resinous boughs. Jennifer and the other women gathered the branches into piles around the perimeter of the plateau. As they worked, the wolves began to mass below them again. Jennifer could see more animals arriving, drawn by the howls of the pack. There were at least 20 now, maybe more. their eyes glowing like coals in the darkness. "They are getting ready for another attack," Pete Morrison observed. Lionel struck a match and lit the first pile of pine boughs. The resin caught immediately, sending up a column of bright flame and thick, acrid smoke. He moved quickly to the other piles, creating a ring of fire around their position. The wolves pulled back from the sudden blaze, but Jennifer could see them regrouping in the forest. They were smart enough to know that fire eventually burned out, and patient enough to wait. "How long will the fires last?" she asked. Lionel studied the burning branches. "An hour? Maybe two, if we are careful with the fuel. 2 hours until dawn. It might be enough if they could keep the fires burning and if the wolves did not find another way up the outcrop." But Jennifer could see the doubt in Lionel's eyes, could hear it in the careful way he spoke. They were running out of time, running out of options, running out of hope. The fires burned bright against the darkness, casting dancing shadows on the granite walls around them. Jennifer sat beside Jessica Green, monitoring the young woman's breathing and trying to keep her warm. The travois had been hard on her, and she was slipping in and out of consciousness. "How is she?" Thomas asked, kneeling beside his wife. "Weak," Jennifer admitted. "The cold and the stress are taking their toll." Thomas Green's face was haggard with worry and pain from his own wounds. The claw marks on his chest had stopped bleeding, but Jennifer could see the exhaustion in his eyes. He was holding himself together through sheer will, but that will was fraying. He said more to himself than to Jennifer. Jennifer hoped he was right, but she had seen enough death to recognize the signs. Jessica's breathing was shallow and irregular, her skin pale and cold despite the blankets. The young woman was fighting for her life, and Jennifer was not sure she was winning. A branch cracked in the forest below, and everyone tensed. The wolves were still there, circling like vultures, waiting for their moment. The fires kept them at bay for now, but Jennifer could see the flames beginning to die down as the pine boughs were consumed. Lionel moved around the perimeter, adding more branches to the fires when he could spare them. But their supply was limited, and each new pile burned faster than the last as the resin was depleted. "We need more fuel," he said quietly to Pete Morrison. The stage driver looked around the bare plateau. "There is not much left up here. A few small trees, some dried grass. It will have to die." They began gathering anything that would burn, stripping bark from the remaining trees, and pulling up clumps of dried vegetation. It was not much, barely enough to keep one fire going, let alone the ring they had created. Douglas Richardson sat with his back against a boulder, his patent medicine case clutched in his lap like a talisman. He had been quiet since they reached the outcrop, staring down at the wolves with the blank expression of a man who had given up hope. "What is in those bottles?" Jennifer asked him. Douglas looked up, seeming surprised by the question. "Medicine," he said automatically. Then more honestly, "Mostly alcohol and sugar water. A few herbs that might help with pain. Any of it flammable." His eyes widened as he understood what she was suggesting. "The alcohol content is high in some of them, maybe 60%. "That will burn," Lionel said, overhearing. "How many bottles do you have?" Douglas opened his case and counted quickly. 12, maybe 13. It was not much, but it might buy them another hour. Lionel took several of the bottles and began pouring the contents over the dying fires. The alcohol caught immediately, sending up new flames that pushed back the darkness. The wolves growled and retreated again, but Jennifer could see their patience was wearing thin. The alpha female, wounded but still alive, was pacing at the base of the slope. She was working up the courage for another assault, and when it came, it would not be a tentative probe. "They are getting ready," Pete Morrison said, checking his rifle. Lionel nodded grimly. "When they come, they will come all at once from multiple directions." "How many shots do we have left?" Thomas asked. 15, Lionel replied, plus whatever Cynthia has in her Derringer. 17 shots against 20 wolves, Douglas said numbly. "Those are not good odds." Jennifer looked around their small group. An injured woman barely clinging to consciousness, a man with a broken arm, another with a head injury that left him confused and slow, a stage driver past his prime, a young husband more concerned with his wife than his own safety, and Lionel, the mountain man who had already saved their lives once and was prepared to die trying to do it again. "There has to be another way," she said. Lionel looked at her with those penetrating blue eyes. "Sometimes there is no other way. Sometimes you just have to stand and fight. "Is that what you did?" she asked quietly. "Is that why you came to the mountains? To stand and fight?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. "I came to the mountains to stop fighting," he said finally, "but it seems to have followed me here." Before Jennifer could ask what he meant, the attack began. It came from three directions at once, just as Lionel had predicted. The alpha female led a charge up the main slope, while two smaller groups attacked from the flanks. The wolves moved with coordinated precision, clearly communicating with each other through subtle signals. Lionel's rifle cracked, dropping the alpha female halfway up the slope. Pete Morrison fired at the same instant, hitting one of the flanking wolves. But there were too many targets, coming too fast. A gray shape leaped over the dying fire on the left side of the plateau. Thomas Green met it with his knife, driving the blade deep into the animal's chest, but the impact knocked him backward. The wolf collapsed on top of him, its weight pinning him to the ground. Jennifer grabbed a burning branch and swung it at another wolf that had made it past the fires. The animal yelped and pulled back, but more were coming. The ring of flame that had protected them was failing, gaps opening where the fires had burned too low. Douglas Richardson surprised everyone by producing a small pistol from his coat. He fired twice at point-blank range into a wolf that was menacing Cynthia Reed, the shots echoing off the granite walls. But for every wolf they dropped, two more seemed to take its place. The plateau was chaos, filled with snarling animals and desperate humans fighting for their lives. Jennifer found herself back-to-back with Lionel, swinging her makeshift torch at anything that moved. She could feel his solid presence behind her, could hear the steady crack of his rifle as he picked his targets with careful precision. "Behind you!" she shouted, seeing a wolf creeping around a boulder. Lionel spun and fired without seeming to aim, the bullet taking the animal in the head. But his rifle was empty now, and there was no time to reload. He drew his revolver and continued firing, each shot deliberate and controlled. Jennifer marveled at his calm in the midst of the chaos, the way he moved and fought as if this was just another day in the mountains. A wolf got past her guard, its claws raking across her arm. She cried out in pain but managed to thrust her torch into its face, driving it back. The scent of burned fur filled the air, acrid and choking. "Jennifer," Lionel called, "the medicine bottles, pour them on the fires." She understood immediately. The remaining bottles of Douglas's patent medicine could revive the flames, create new barriers against the attacking wolves. She grabbed the case and began smashing bottles against the rocks, letting the alcohol splash onto the dying embers. The fires roared back to life, brighter and hotter than before. The wolves pulled back, yelping as the flames singed their fur. For a moment, the plateau was clear of attackers. But Jennifer could see more wolves gathering in the forest below. The pack seemed endless, reinforced by animals drawn from miles around by the scent of blood and the promise of easy prey. Quote 240 for, she asked Lionel. He checked his revolver. Quote 245. Pete Morrison was reloading his rifle, his hands shaking with exhaustion. Quote 246. 6 shots against a pack that seemed to grow larger every minute. Jennifer looked around the plateau at the wounded and exhausted survivors, at the dying fires that barely held the wolves at bay. They had fought bravely, but it was not enough. It was never going to be enough. The eastern horizon was beginning to show the faintest hint of gray, the first suggestion of dawn still hours away. They would not last that long. The wolves knew it, and so did she. But as she prepared to make her peace with death, a new sound reached her ears. Distant at first, barely audible over the crackling of the fires and the growling of the wolves. Hoofbeats. Lionel heard them too, his head snapping up as he strained to listen. The sound was growing louder, coming from the direction of the main road. Multiple horses, moving fast. Quote 247, he said, his voice filled with sudden hope. The wolves heard them as well. Their heads turned toward the approaching sound, ears pricked forward. The pack began to shift nervously, sensing the arrival of new players in their deadly game. A shout echoed through the forest, a human voice calling out in the darkness. Then another, and another. Jennifer could see torches moving between the trees, bobbing points of light that grew brighter as they approached. Lionel shouted at the top of his lungs, quote 249. An answering call came from below, and Jennifer felt tears of relief spring to her eyes. Rescue was coming. After all the fear and desperation, help had finally arrived. But the wolves were not retreating. If anything, they seemed more agitated by the approaching riders, more determined to finish what they had started. The alpha female, wounded but still alive, was rallying the pack for one final assault. Wote 250? Pete Morrison warned, raising his rifle. The last attack was the most vicious yet. The wolves came with desperate fury, knowing their time was running out. They leaped over the dying fires, accepting burns in their determination to reach their prey. Lionel fired his last two shots, dropping two animals at point-blank range. Pete Morrison's rifle cracked 4 times in rapid succession, each shot finding its mark. But there were still wolves on the plateau, snarling and snapping as they closed in on the exhausted humans. Jennifer swung her torch with all her remaining strength, keeping one wolf at bay while Lionel drew his knife to face another. The animal was huge, scarred from previous battles, with yellow eyes full of intelligent malice. The wolf and the man circled each other on the narrow plateau, each looking for an opening. Jennifer wanted to help, but she had her own battle to fight, her own predator to face. The scarred wolf feinted left, then lunged right, going for Lionel's throat. He sidestepped at the last instant, his knife flashing in the firelight. The blade caught the animal in the ribs, but the wolf's momentum carried it forward, and both man and beast went down in a tangle of limbs. Jennifer heard Lionel grunt in pain, saw blood on his shirt. The wolf was on top of him, snapping at his face while he struggled to keep its jaws away from his throat. She abandoned her own fight and threw herself at the wolf, wrapping her arms around its neck and pulling backward with all her strength. The animal turned on her, its claws raking across her chest, adding new wounds to her collection of scars. But her intervention gave Lionel the opening he needed. His knife found the wolf's heart, sliding between the ribs with surgical precision. The animal collapsed with a shuddering breath, its yellow eyes going dark. The sound of gunfire erupted from the forest below as the rescue party engaged the remaining wolves. Jennifer could hear men shouting, horses neighing, the crack of rifles as the tide of battle finally turned in their favor. Within minutes, the shooting stopped. The surviving wolves had fled deeper into the forest, their pack broken and scattered. The immediate danger was over. Quote 251. A voice called from below. Quote tufon, quote offron. Lionel called back, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. Quote tafrian, quote tom. The rescue party consisted of 6 men from the nearest settlement, led by a grizzled sheriff named William Hayes. They had been tracking the wolf pack for days, following reports of livestock kills and missing travelers. The sound of gunfire had drawn them to the outcrop just in time. Quote 256, Sheriff Hayes said as his men helped the survivors down from the plateau. Quote 257, Jennifer found herself being half carried down the rocky slope by one of the deputies, her legs too weak to support her weight. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the fight was wearing off, leaving her shaking and exhausted. Lionel walked beside her, one arm pressed against his ribs where the wolf had clawed him. Blood seeped through his fingers, but he refused help, insisting the others were hurt worse. Quote 258, Jennifer told him. Quote 259. He replied, but she could see the pain in his eyes. They reached the base of the outcrop where the rescue party had set up a temporary camp. A large fire burned in a clearing, surrounded by bedrolls and supplies. The warmth felt like a blessing after the cold terror of the plateau. Jessica Green was carefully loaded onto a stretcher, her breathing shallow but steady. Thomas stayed close beside her, holding her hand and whispering words of encouragement. The young woman's eyes fluttered open briefly, focusing on her husband's face. "Tear to sit down," she whispered. He said, tears streaming down his cheeks. Sheriff Hayes examined the wounded with the practiced eye of a man who had seen his share of violence. He announced. Lionel said. The sheriff replied. One of the deputies, a young man with medical training, began cleaning and bandaging the various injuries. Jennifer submitted to his ministrations, wincing as he cleaned the claw marks on her arm and chest. He told her. Jennifer almost laughed at that. What were a few more scars to add to her collection? She had 7 already, each one telling a story of survival. Soon she would have 8, 9, maybe 10. The stories of this night, written in her flesh for all to see. Quote 270, the deputy said gently. Quote 271. Jennifer realized she was crying, tears streaming down her scarred cheeks. But they were not tears of pain or of fear. They were tears of relief, of gratitude, of something she could not quite name. She said. The deputy nodded and moved on to check on Cynthia Reed, who was sitting quietly by the fire with her broken arm cradled against her chest. The older woman had borne the entire ordeal with remarkable courage, never complaining, never giving up hope. Douglas Richardson sat nearby, staring at the remains of his patent medicine case. Most of the bottles had been broken in the fight, their contents used to fuel the fires that had saved their lives. Quote 274, he said sadly. Quote 275. Quote Chavex, Sheriff Hayes pointed out. Quote sounded, quote, Douglas replied, but he did not sound convinced. As the deputy worked on Lionel's wounds, Jennifer found herself studying the mountain man's face in the firelight. He bore the pain stoically, never flinching as the young man cleaned and stitched the worst of the claw marks. Quote 279, she said quietly. Lionel looked at her with those penetrating blue eyes. Quote 280. It was true, Jennifer realized. They had all fought, all contributed to their survival. Even Douglas Richardson with his patent medicine bottles that had fueled the fires. Even Jessica Green, whose courage in the face of death had inspired them all. She asked, Lionel said, Denver. The word seemed strange to her now, like something from a half-remembered dream. Had she really been planning to disappear into that distant city? To lose herself among strangers who would never see past her scars? She asked, quote, 285. Quote, Lionel was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. Quote, he confirmed, but Jennifer heard something in his voice, a note of uncertainty that had not been there before. The offer he had made earlier, before the wolves attacked, seemed to hang in the air between them like an unspoken question. Sheriff Hayes approached them, his weathered face serious. Quote, he said, quote, the rescue party broke camp quickly, loading the wounded onto improvised stretchers and preparing for the journey back to civilization. Jennifer found herself walking beside Lionel again, matching his steady pace as they made their way through the forest. The sun was rising now, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of gold and rose. The beauty of it took Jennifer's breath away, made her understand why someone might choose to live in this wild country, despite its dangers. It is beautiful, she said. Lionel followed her gaze to the mountains. It is, he agreed, hard, but beautiful. Like life itself, Jennifer thought. Hard and dangerous and beautiful all at once. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Jennifer found herself thinking about the choice she had almost made the night before, when the stage had arrived to take her to Denver. It seemed like a lifetime ago now, that moment of standing between two worlds. Your offer, she said suddenly, to stay at your cabin. Did you mean it? Lionel looked at her, his expression unreadable. I do not say things I do not mean. Even after everything that happened, the wolves, the danger, especially after that, he said, you fought beside me tonight, saved my life as much as I saved yours. That means something. Jennifer felt her heart skip a beat. What does it mean? It means you belong here, Lionel said quietly, in this hard, beautiful country, with someone who sees your scars as stories worth hearing. The words hit her like a physical blow, so unexpected and powerful that she stumbled. Lionel caught her arm, steadying her, his touch gentle despite his own injuries. I do not understand, she whispered. You have 7 scars, he said, his voice soft but clear. Each one tells a story of survival, of refusing to give up when the world tried to break you. Those are not marks of shame, Jennifer. They are badges of honor. Jennifer stared at him, unable to speak. No one had ever spoken to her that way, ever seen her scars as anything but disfigurement. But Lionel looked at her as if she was beautiful, damaged but whole, scarred but strong. I do not know how to live into the mountains, she said finally. I can teach you. I do not know how to survive in the wilderness. You already proved you can. I do not know how to trust someone. Lionel was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the morning light. Neither do I, he said finally. but maybe we can learn together. The rescue party was pulling ahead of them, and Jennifer knew she would have to make her decision soon. Go with Sheriff Hayes back to town, catch another stage to Denver, disappear into the anonymous crowds of the city, or stay with this mysterious mountain man who saw beauty in her scars and strength in her survival. Why do you live alone? She asked. What brought you to the mountains? Lionel's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he would not answer. Then he said, quote, 314. Jennifer understood then. The invisible wounds that drove men to seek solitude, to escape the judgment of a world that could not understand what they had endured. Quote 345, she asked gently. Quote boss, his voice was flat, emotionless. Quote on, quote round, quote Erman. Jennifer reached out without thinking, her fingers brushing against his hand. He did not pull away. Quote Bonda, she said quietly. Quote Dornser, quote bound, quoted down, quoted short, and Lionel he looked at her, and in his blue eyes she saw something she had never expected to see. Hope. Quote 325, he said. Sheriff Hayes called a halt when they reached the main road, where his horses were waiting with the rest of his men. The wounded were loaded into a wagon for the journey back to town, Jessica Green still unconscious but breathing steadily. Quote 326, and the sheriff told Thomas Green. Quote 327, Thomas nodded gratefully, his face haggard with exhaustion and worry. Quote Frottenham, quote Tron. Jennifer helped load supplies into the wagon, her mind racing as she tried to process everything that had happened. The wolf attack seemed like a nightmare now, something that could not possibly have been real. But the fresh bandages on her arms and the ache in her muscles told a different story. Lionel stood apart from the group, checking his rifle and preparing for the journey back to his cabin. He had said little since their conversation on the trail, but Jennifer could feel his eyes on her as she worked. The moment of decision was approaching, and she still did not know what choice to make. Part of her longed for the safety and anonymity of Denver, for the chance to disappear among strangers who would never ask about her scars. But another part, a part that had been awakened by the night's events, yearned for something different. Miss Lewis, Sheriff Hayes called, we are ready to go. Jennifer looked at the wagon, at the other survivors preparing for the journey to town. Then she looked at Lionel, standing alone beside the road with his pack and his rifle. I need a moment, she said. She walked over to where Lionel waited, her heart pounding with uncertainty. Up close, she could see the exhaustion in his face, the pain from his wounds that he was trying to hide. You should go with them, he said quietly. Get your wounds properly tended, rest in a real bed. Is that what you want? Lionel was quiet for a long moment, staring down the road toward town. What I want and what is best for you might not be the same thing. Let me decide what is best for me. He looked at her then, his blue eyes searching her face. You do not know me, Jennifer. You do not know what kind of man I really am. I know you risked your life to save strangers. I know you fought beside me against the wolves. I know you see something in my scars that no one else ever has. That is not enough to build a life on. Maybe not, Jennifer admitted, but it is enough to start with. Lionel reached out and touched her face, his fingers tracing the largest scar with infinite gentleness. You deserve better than a broken soldier hiding in the mountains. And you deserve better than a scarred woman that no one else wants. I want you, he said simply. The words hung in the air between them, honest and raw and terrifying in their simplicity. Jennifer felt her breath catch, felt something deep inside her chest crack open like ice in spring. Then ask me again, she whispered. Lionel's hand cupped her scarred cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear she had not realized was fallen in. Quote 347, Jennifer closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the decision settle on her shoulders. Behind her, Sheriff Hayes was calling for the last passengers to board the wagon. The road to town, to safety, to the life she had planned, stretched out before her. But when she opened her eyes, all she could see was Lionel's face, weathered and scarred in his own way, but kind, so very kind. All right, she said, all right, I will stay. Lionel's face transformed, the careful mask he wore slipping to reveal something vulnerable and hopeful underneath. Quote 351, quote 352, Jennifer said honestly. Quote 353. She turned toward the wagon where Sheriff Hayes was waiting impatiently. Quote 354, she called. Quote 355, Hayes looked surprised. Quote 356, Quote 37. The sheriff shrugged, clearly thinking she was making a mistake but unwilling to argue. Quote to 358. The wagon pulled away, carrying the other survivors toward town in safety and the lives they had left behind. Jennifer watched it disappear around a bend in the road, feeling a mixture of fear and excitement that made her dizzy. Quote defiant, and Lionel asked. Quote down, Jennifer admitted. Quote down. They began the walk back to his cabin, following a trail that wound up into the mountains. The snow crunched under their feet, and the air grew thinner as they climbed. Jennifer's wounds ached, and her legs trembled with exhaustion, but she kept walking. Tell me about the first scar, Lionel said as they walked. Jennifer touched her face unconsciously, feeling the familiar ridge of tissue. The carriage accident. I was 16, traveling with my parents to visit my aunt in Colorado Springs. What happened? A wheel came off going down a steep hill. The carriage rolled and I was thrown through the window. She paused, remembering. My parents were killed instantly. I spent 3 months in bed, recovering from my injuries. Who took care of you? My aunt, at first. Then I had to learn to take care of myself. Lionel nodded, understanding. The other scars, learning to be independent. Yes, burns from cooking, cuts from kitchen knives, falls from horses I was learning to ride. Each one a lesson in survival. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds their breathing and the crunch of snow underfoot. Jennifer found herself studying Lionel's profile as he walked, noting the way he moved with easy confidence through the wilderness that had nearly killed her. Quote 371, she asked. Quote 272. Lionel was quiet for so long she thought he would not answer. Then he said, quote 373, quote to 35, quote to mine. Jennifer could hear the pain in his voice, the weight of memories he carried like stones in his heart. Quote 376, quote on, he said simply, quote, reaction, quote. Lionel stopped walking and looked around at the snow-covered peaks that surrounded them. Quote on, and quote, Shawnata, quote. They reached the cabin as the sun was setting, painting the snow-covered clearing in shades of gold and purple. Smoke rose from the chimney and warm light spilled from the windows. It looked like home, Jennifer thought, like safety and peace and the possibility of happiness. Lionel opened the door and gestured for her to enter first. The cabin was exactly as they had left it, warm and welcoming and filled with the promise of shelter from the storms outside. He asked. Jennifer realized she was starving. They had not eaten since the night before, and the ordeal with the wolves had drained what little energy she had left. Lionel moved around the kitchen with practiced efficiency, preparing a simple meal of bread and stew and coffee. Jennifer sat by the fire, watching him work and marveling at the domesticity of the scene. When had she last shared a meal with someone who wanted her company? They ate in comfortable silence, both too tired for much conversation. The food was simple but delicious, warming her from the inside out. The coffee was strong and bitter, exactly what she needed. Quote 385, she asked when they had finished eating. Lionel looked around the one-room cabin, clearly not having thought that far ahead. Quote 386, quote 387, quote 388. Jennifer started to argue, then saw the stubborn set of his jaw and realized it would be pointless. This was clearly a matter of principle for him, and she was too tired to fight about it. She settled into the narrow bed, pulling the thick quilts up to her chin. The mattress was surprisingly comfortable, stuffed with pine needles that gave off a clean, resinous scent. Through the small window beside the bed, she could see stars scattered across the clear mountain sky. Lionel banked the fire and settled onto his makeshift bed, his rifle within easy reach. Old habits, Jennifer supposed. The caution of a soldier who had learned to sleep with one eye open. She said quietly. He was quiet for a moment, then said, quote 393. Jennifer closed her eyes and listened to the wind sighing through the pine trees outside. For the first time in years, she felt safe. Not just physically safe, but emotionally safe. Protected not by walls or locks, but by the presence of someone who valued her for who she was. She slept without dreams, a deep, peaceful sleep that lasted until the sun was high in the sky. When she woke, Lionel was already up, moving quietly around the cabin as he prepared breakfast. The smell of bacon and coffee filled the air, and Jennifer felt her stomach growl in response. Quote 394, he said when he saw her stirring. Quote 395. Jennifer sat up, wincing as her wounds protested the movement. Quote 396. Quote 397. She had needed it, Jennifer realized, not just the sleep, but the sense of security that had allowed her to truly rest for the first time in months. She asked. Lionel set a plate of food in front of her, his expression thoughtful. Quote 39, quote John, quote Shuren. Jennifer took a bite of bacon, savoring the rich, smoky flavor. Quote Vajan and quote Fortunan. The thought should have been frightening, being trapped in a small cabin with a man she barely knew. Instead, Jennifer felt a sense of anticipation, of possibility. For the first time in her life, she had time. Time to heal, time to learn, time to become the person she was meant to be. Quote 404, Lionel said as they ate. Jennifer touched the small mark on her neck, remembering. Quote 405, quote 47. Lionel nodded, understanding. Quote 408, quote 409. They talked through breakfast, Jennifer sharing the stories of her scars while Lionel listened with the attention of someone who understood that every mark told a tale worth hearing. It was a strange intimacy, this sharing of pain and survival, but it felt right somehow. After breakfast, Lionel began teaching her about life in the mountains, how to split wood, how to preserve food for winter, how to read the signs that warned of coming storms. Jennifer proved to be a quick learner, her years of forced independence serving her well. As the days passed, they fell into an easy routine. Lionel would hunt and trap while Jennifer tended the cabin and learned the skills she would need to survive the winter. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire and talk, sharing stories of their past and dreams of their future. Slowly, carefully, they began to trust each other. But even as Jennifer found herself growing comfortable in her new life, she could not shake the feeling that something was coming. Some challenge or test that would determine whether this fragile peace could last. She was right. The trouble came with the first heavy snow of winter, in the form of three men on horseback who appeared at the cabin door just as the storm was beginning to rage. Jennifer recognized one of them immediately, and her blood turned to ice. George Foster, the store owner from Cedar Ridge, had come to take her back. The three men stood in the doorway like harbingers of doom, snow swirling around them in the bitter wind. George Foster stepped forward, his face red with cold and anger, his eyes fixed on Jennifer with the intensity of a man who had traveled far to settle a score. He said, his voice carrying the weight of authority he had never possessed. Quote, for more than a human. Jennifer felt her heart sink as she recognized the other two men. Samuel Brooks, the town banker who had always looked at her with distaste, and Marcus Webb, the sheriff's deputy who enforced the will of men like Foster and Brooks. Lionel stepped between Jennifer and the intruders, his hand resting casually on the grip of his revolver. I think you have made a mistake, he said quietly. The lady is here of her own free will. Foster's eyes narrowed as he took in Lionel's appearance, the weathered face and confident bearing of a man who was not easily intimidated. And who might you be? Lionel Reed, this is my cabin, and Miss Lewis is my guest. Your guest, Samuel Brooks said with a sneer. Is that what you call it when a man takes advantage of a woman in distress? Jennifer saw Lionel's jaw tighten, saw his hand shift slightly on his weapon. Foster said, Jennifer said, finding her voice. Quote 422, quote 423. Brooks replied with obvious disbelief. Quote 424 dem, the implication hung in the air like poison. Jennifer felt her cheeks burn with shame and anger, felt the familiar weight of judgment settling on her shoulders. These men saw only what they expected to see, a scarred woman who could be nothing more than a victim or a whore. Quote 525. Marcus Webb said, speaking for the first time. Quote 5 and a quote 5, Jennifer asked. Foster shifted uncomfortably. Quote Fritas. Jennifer almost laughed at that. The same church ladies who had whispered behind their hands when she walked past, who had made it clear that her scars were an offense to their sensibilities. Now they wanted to help her, to save her from the terrible fate of living with a man who saw beauty in her damaged face. She said firmly, quote, had 430, quote, 431. Foster insisted, quote, 432, quote, 433 some. Brooks stepped forward, his banker's mind calculating the angles. Miss Lewis, be reasonable. What future do you have here? What security? This man could abandon you at any time, leave you stranded in the mountains with no way to survive. He could, Jennifer agreed, but he will not. How can you be sure? Jennifer looked at Lionel, at the steady strength in his blue eyes, at the way he stood ready to defend her against any threat. Because I know him. You know him? Foster scoffed. You have known him for 2 weeks. I have known you for 3 years, watched you work, seen your character. You are a decent woman who has been led astray by circumstances. I am a woman who has finally found a place where she belongs. The words came out stronger than Jennifer had intended, ringing with a conviction that surprised even her. She did belong here, she realized, in this harsh, beautiful country with this quiet, damaged man who saw her scars as stories worth hearing. Foster's face darkened. Quote, was a quote from Jennifer repeated. Quote, Bartz's quote, the quote from Jennifer stepped forward, her voice rising. Quote, courage on. Foster's silence was answer enough. Miss Lewis, Marcus Webb said, his hand moving to his badge, I have authority to bring you back to Cedar Ridge for your own protection. Protection from what? Lionel asked, his voice dangerously quiet. From men who would take advantage of her situation. Like you are trying to do now. The tension in the room ratcheted higher, 3 armed men facing one, with Jennifer caught in the middle. She could see the calculation in Webb's eyes, the way he was measuring distances and angles. The deputy was considering violence, and that could only end badly for everyone. Quote, 453, she said quickly, stepping between the opposing forces. Quote, 454. Quote, 455 ounds, Brooks said smugly. Quote, 456 feet. Jennifer felt the blood drain from her face. She had heard of such cases, women declared mentally unfit and placed under the guardianship of men who claimed to have their best interests at heart. It was a legal trap that could strip her of all autonomy, all choice in her own life. Foster said, Code 459. Lionel's revolver cleared leather so fast Jennifer barely saw the movement. One moment his hand was resting casually on the grip. The next, the weapon was pointed directly at Foster's chest. He said quietly. Webb's hand moved toward his own gun, but froze when Lionel's eyes shifted to him. Webb said, the standoff stretched out, tension crackling in the air like lightning before a storm. Jennifer could see the wheels turning in Foster's mind, weighing the cost of pushing this confrontation to its inevitable conclusion. This is not over, he said finally. Miss Lewis, you have 1 week to come to your senses. After that, we will be back with proper legal authority. You do that, Lionel replied, but next time you might want to bring more men. The 3 visitors backed toward the door, their eyes never leaving Lionel's gun. Foster paused at the threshold, his face twisted with anger and frustration. Good 468. Then they were gone, swallowed by the storm that raged outside. Lionel holstered his weapon and moved to bar the door, his face grim with the knowledge that this was only the beginning. Quote 469, he said. Quote Forstem, quote Buppendert, and Jennifer sank into a chair by the fire, her hands shaking with reaction. Quote Fawn, quote Arthur, quote Fun. Lionel was quiet for a moment, staring into the flames. Quote 475, Jennifer felt despair settling over her like a shroud. Just when she had found something worth fighting for, forces beyond her control were conspiring to take it away. The same forces that had driven her from town after town, that had made her feel worthless and unwanted. Lionel said quietly, quote 477, quote Fatum. The word hung in the air between them, simple and complex at the same time. Marriage would give her legal protection, make it impossible for Foster and his allies to claim she was an incompetent woman in need of male guardianship. But marriage was also permanent, binding, a commitment that could not be undone on a whim. And they had known each other for only 2 weeks, built their relationship on shared danger and mutual need rather than love. Quote 479, Jennifer asked. Lionel looked at her, his blue eyes reflecting the firelight. Quote Vian, quote Vaduin. He was quiet for a long moment, and Jennifer could see him struggling with emotions he was not used to expressing. Quote Panana, he said finally, but quote Bumbarden, quote Jennifer stared into the fire, weighing her options. She could go back with Foster, submit to the guardianship of men who saw her as a burden to be managed. She could run again, try to disappear into another city where no one knew her story. Or she could stay and fight for the life she was building here. Quote 486, she said quietly. Lionel knelt beside her chair, his weathered hands taking hers with infinite gentleness. Quote 487. she looked into his face, at the scars that marked him as surely as hers marked her, at the kindness and strength that had drawn her to him from the beginning. She said, Lionel's face transformed, the careful mask slipping to reveal joy and relief, and something that might have been love. He leaned forward and kissed her, gently, tentatively, as if she might break under his touch. Jennifer kissed him back, tasting hope and possibility and the promise of a future she had never dared imagine. When they broke apart, she could hear the wind howling outside, the storm that would trap them together for the long winter months ahead. But she was no longer afraid of being trapped. She was exactly where she belonged. They will still come back, she said. Let them come, Lionel replied. By then you will be my wife, and they will have no legal claim on you. Will that be enough? Lionel's hand moved to the rifle mounted above the fireplace, and Jennifer saw something hard and dangerous flicker in his eyes. But even as they held each other by the fire, even as they planned their future together, Jennifer could not shake the feeling that George Foster would not give up so easily. Men like him did not accept defeat gracefully, especially when their authority was challenged by someone they considered beneath them. The storm raged outside, and somewhere in that storm, 3 angry men were planning their return. When they came back, Jennifer knew, it would not be with legal papers and reasonable arguments. It would be with violence. And when that moment came, she and Lionel would face it together, scarred and damaged but unbroken. 2 souls who had found in each other the strength to stand against a world that wanted to tear them apart. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls, and Jennifer traced the largest scar on her face with one finger. 7 scars, 7 stories of survival. Soon she thought there might be more stories to tell. But for now, in this moment, she was safe and loved and home. The storm could rage all it wanted. She was not going anywhere. The storm had passed by morning, leaving the world wrapped in pristine white silence. Jennifer stood at the cabin window, watching the sun paint the snow-covered peaks in shades of gold and rose. 3 days had passed since George Foster and his men had left. 3 days of peace that felt too fragile to trust. Lionel moved quietly behind her, preparing coffee and checking their supplies. They had spoken little about the confrontation, both understanding that words could not change what was coming. Foster would return, and when he did, it would be with enough force to ensure he got what he wanted. Lionel said quietly. Jennifer nodded, her breath fogging the glass as she watched a hawk circle high above the trees. Marriage would provide legal protection, but she wondered if it would be enough to stop men like Foster who believed they knew what was best for everyone. Quote 496, she said. Quote 497. Quote 470. Quote 499. Lionel joined her at the window, his shoulder brushing against hers. Quote Funaground. Quote 41. Quote 4 as Jennifer turned to study his profile, noting the determined set of his jaw. Quote 4. Quote 4. It was not the most romantic proposal, but Jennifer found herself oddly touched by his practical devotion. Lionel was not a man given to flowery speeches or grand gestures. His love showed itself in action, in the steady determination to keep her safe. They prepared for the journey to town, packing supplies and checking their weapons. The ride would take most of the day through mountain passes that could be treacherous in winter. But staying at the cabin meant waiting for Foster to return with reinforcements. And that was a risk they could not afford. Lionel saddled his horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Buck, who had carried him through countless mountain winters. Jennifer would ride behind him, her arms wrapped around his waist for warmth and security. It was not the most comfortable arrangement, but it was the safest way to travel the narrow mountain trails. As they prepared to leave, Jennifer found herself taking one last look around the cabin that had become her sanctuary. The simple room with its stone fireplace and handmade furniture represented everything she had never dared hope for. A place where she belonged, where her scars were seen as stories rather than shame. Lionel said, understanding her hesitation. Good 506. Jennifer voiced the fear that had been growing in her chest. Good 57. Good 5. Lionel's calm certainty steadied her nerves. He had survived a war and carved out a life in these harsh mountains. If anyone could navigate the treacherous waters of small-town politics and legal maneuvering, it was him. They set out as the sun climbed higher, following a trail that wound down through stands of pine and aspen toward the valley below. The snow was deep but packed firm by wind and cold, providing good footing for the horse. Jennifer pressed close to Lionel's back, feeling his solid warmth through the thick wool of his coat. The journey gave her time to think, to process everything that had happened since that night when the stage had overturned in the blizzard. 2 weeks ago, she had been a lonely woman fleeing to Denver with nothing but a few coins and the clothes on her back. Now she was riding through the mountains to marry a man she barely knew, fighting for a life she had never imagined possible. It should have been terrifying, this leap into the unknown. Instead, Jennifer felt a sense of rightness, as if all the pain and struggle of her past had been leading to this moment. The scars that had marked her as damaged goods in the eyes of the world had brought her to a man who saw them as proof of her strength. They stopped at midday to rest the horse and eat a simple meal of bread and dried meat. The valley spread out below them, a patchwork of snow-covered fields and dark forest. Smoke rose from the chimneys of distant farmhouses, and Jennifer could see the rooftops of Millfield gleaming in the winter sun. Quote 509 saw Lionel asked, offering her a drink from his water bottle. Quote 510, Jennifer admitted. Quote 511 moaned. Quote 512. His honesty made her smile. Most men would have denied their fear, claimed to be completely confident in their plans. But Lionel was different, secure enough in his masculinity to admit uncertainty. Quote 533, she asked. Quote 514. Lionel was quiet for a moment, staring down at the town below. Quote 515, he said finally. Quote 5 and quote 5. He looked at her then, his blue eyes serious and intent. Quote 518. Jennifer felt her heart skip a beat. It was not a declaration of love in the traditional sense, but it was something deeper. Recognition, acceptance, the promise of a partnership built on mutual understanding rather than romantic fantasy. Quote 519, she said quietly. Quote 520. They remounted and continued down the mountain, reaching the outskirts of Millfield as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks. The town was larger than Cedar Ridge, but still small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business. Jennifer could feel eyes watching them as they rode down the main street, could hear the whispers that followed in their wake. The church stood at the center of town, a simple white building with a tall steeple that pointed toward heaven, like an accusation. Pastor Williams lived in a small house behind the church, and smoke rising from his chimney suggested he was home. Lionel helped Jennifer down from the horse and tied Buck to the hitching post outside the pastor's gate. They walked up the path together, their boots crunching on the packed snow, and knocked on the front door. Pastor Williams was a man in his 50s with kind eyes and graying hair that suggested wisdom earned through experience. He opened the door with a welcoming smile that faltered slightly when he saw Jennifer's scars. Good afternoon, and he said, recovering quickly. How may I help you? We would like to be married, Lionel said without preamble. The pastor's eyebrows rose in surprise. Pastor Williams studied them both, his experienced eyes taking in their travel-worn clothes and the urgency in their manner. Quote 546, quote, Jennifer said. Quote, unquote, fin. The pastor stepped aside and gestured for them to enter. Quote, Arnon. The interior of the house was warm and comfortable, filled with books and the scent of pipe tobacco. Pastor Williams led them to a sitting room where a fire crackled in a stone hearth. He gestured for them to sit while he settled into a chair across from them. Quote 531, he said, his voice gentle but probing. Quote 532. Jennifer and Lionel exchanged glances, both aware that the truth might sound strange to conventional ears. Quote 533. Jennifer said honestly. Quote 534. The pastor leaned back in his chair. Quote 535. Quote 5, Lionel said. Quote 537. Jennifer took a deep breath, knowing that their chances of convincing the pastor depended on honesty. Quote 538. Quote 539. The blunt statement hung in the air between them. Jennifer nodded, grateful that the pastor was not pretending not to notice her disfigurement. Pastor Williams was quiet for a long moment, his fingers steepled as he considered their situation. Quote 41, quote 5, Jennifer said. Quote Farnton, quote Farna, the pastor agreed. Quote Farnton. Lionel spoke for the first time since they had sat down. Quote 546 to quote 547. Jennifer looked at Lionel, at the steady strength in his blue eyes, at the hands that had pulled her from the wreckage of the stagecoach and fought beside her against the wolves. Quote 548, Pastor Williams nodded slowly. Quote 549. He paused, studying their faces. Quote fine, quote found, Jennifer asked. Quote found, quote fibers, they both said. Quote fires, quote five, quote rups. The pastor stood and moved to a desk in the corner of the room. Quote 557 found. Within an hour they were standing in the small church with Pastor Williams, his wife Martha, and their neighbor Samuel Thompson. The ceremony was simple and brief, but Jennifer found herself moved by the ancient words that bound her life to Lionel's. Do you, Lionel Reed, take Jennifer Lewis to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part? I do. Do you, Jennifer Lewis, take Lionel Reed to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part? Jennifer looked into Lionel's eyes and saw her future reflected there. Not the future she had planned, but the one she had never dared dream of. But after good question. Lionel's lips were warm and gentle against hers, the kiss sealing a promise that went deeper than legal protection. They were partners now, bound together by choice and circumstance and the hope of building something lasting from the wreckage of their separate pasts. Pastor Williams filled out the marriage certificate with careful precision, his pen scratching across the paper that would serve as proof of their union. Congratulations, he said, handing them the document. May your marriage be blessed with happiness and understanding. They thanked the pastor and his wife, then stepped out into the gathering dusk. The temperature was dropping as the sun disappeared behind the mountains, and Jennifer could feel snow beginning to fall again. We should find a place to stay tonight, Lionel said. The trail back to the cabin will be dangerous in the dark. There was a small hotel on Main Street, and they secured a room for the night. It was modest but clean, with a double bed and a window that looked out on the snow-covered street. Jennifer stood at that window while Lionel tended to his horse, watching the townspeople hurry past with their heads down against the wind. She was married. The thought felt strange and wonderful and terrifying all at once. In the space of a few hours, her entire legal status had changed. She was no longer Jennifer Lewis, the scarred spinster who worked in other people's stores. She was Jennifer Reed, wife of a mountain man, with all the rights and protections that marriage provided. Lionel returned from the stable, stamping snow from his boots and hanging his coat by the door. Quote 567. Jennifer realized she was starving. The tension of the day had suppressed her appetite, but now that the ceremony was over, she felt hollow with hunger. Quote 568. They walked through the falling snow to a small restaurant that served simple but hearty food. The other diners glanced at them curiously, noting Jennifer's scars and Lionel's weathered appearance, but no one stared openly or made comments. It was a relief to be treated as ordinary customers rather than objects of pity or disgust. Over dinner, they talked about practical matters: when to return to the cabin, how to prepare for Foster's inevitable return, what legal steps they might need to take to protect their marriage from challenge. It was not romantic conversation, but Jennifer found it comforting in its normalcy. Do you think he will give up now that we are married? She asked. Lionel cut a piece of beef with deliberate precision. Men like Foster do not give up easily. They see opposition as a personal insult. So he will come back. He will come back. With more men. Probably. Jennifer felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. What do we do then? We defend what is ours. The simple statement carried the weight of absolute commitment. Lionel was prepared to fight for their life together, to risk everything rather than let other people dictate their choices. It should have frightened her, but instead Jennifer felt a fierce pride in the man she had married. They returned to the hotel as the snow began to fall more heavily, transforming the quiet street into a winter wonderland. In their room, they prepared for bed with the awkwardness of newlyweds who were still learning each other's habits. Jennifer sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly aware that this was their wedding night. They had shared the cabin for weeks, but always with the understanding that their arrangement was temporary, conditional. Now they were husband and wife, bound together by law and custom and their own freely given promises. Quote 577. Lionel offered, understanding her nervousness. Quote 578. Jennifer said quickly. Quote 579. Lionel nodded and began preparing for bed with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything. Jennifer watched him move around the small room, noting the careful way he placed his weapons within easy reach, the habitual caution of a man who had learned to sleep with one eye open. When they finally lay down together, Jennifer was acutely aware of his presence beside her. Not threatening or demanding, just solidly there, a source of warmth and protection in a world that had offered her precious little of either. Quote 580, she said quietly. Quote 581, quote 582, and Lionel turned toward her in the darkness, his hand finding hers under the covers. Quote 583 now. Jennifer felt tears prick her eyes. Even now, after everything they had been through, his acceptance of her damaged face surprised her. She had spent so many years believing that her scars made her unlovable, unmarriageable, unworthy of happiness. Quote 584, she whispered, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Lionel was quiet for so long that Jennifer began to worry she had made a mistake, moved too fast, assumed feelings that were not there. Then his thumb brushed across her knuckles, a gentle caress that spoke louder than words. He said quietly. They lay together in the darkness, holding hands like children afraid of the dark. And Jennifer felt a peace she had not known since before her parents died. She was loved. She was wanted. She belonged somewhere with someone who saw her scars as proof of her strength rather than evidence of her damage. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with fresh snow sparkling in the sunlight. They ate breakfast at the hotel restaurant, then prepared for the journey back to the cabin. Lionel checked his weapons and secured their supplies while Jennifer said goodbye to Pastor Williams and thanked him again for performing the ceremony. The ride back through the mountains was beautiful but treacherous, the new snow hiding patches of ice that could send a horse tumbling down the steep slopes. Lionel navigated the trail with the skill of someone who knew every rock and tree, but Jennifer could feel the tension in his body as he concentrated on keeping them safe. They were within sight of the cabin when they saw the smoke, not the thin wisp that should have been rising from their own chimney, but thick black columns that spoke of destruction and violence. Lionel urged Buck forward, and they crested the final ridge to see their worst fears realized. The cabin was burning. Men on horseback surrounded the blazing structure, their faces lit by the orange glow of the flames. Jennifer counted at least 8 riders, more than enough to overwhelm any resistance they might have offered. At the center of the group sat George Foster, his face twisted with satisfaction as he watched their home burn. Lionel pulled Buck to a halt behind a stand of pine trees, his hand moving instinctively to his rifle. Quote 587, he whispered. Quote to 588. Jennifer pressed close to his back, her heart hammering with rage and despair. Everything they had built together, the sanctuary where she had finally found peace, was being destroyed by men who believed they knew what was best for her. She breathed. Quote 5, no. Lionel replied grimly. Quote 5, I need one. One of the riders, a man Jennifer did not recognize, called out to Foster. Quote 5, Andu. Foster's voice carried clearly across the clearing. They will be back. This is all they have. When they see what happened here, they will know we mean business. What if they do not come back? Another man asked. What if they just keep running? Then we track them down, Foster said. Miss Lewis belongs in civilization, not living like a savage in the wilderness. We will find her and bring her back where she belongs. Jennifer felt Lionel's muscles tense beneath her hands. She could sense the violence coiled in him, the soldier's instinct to meet force with force. But 8 men against 1, even a man as skilled as Lionel, would be suicide. We need to get away from here, she whispered. Lionel nodded, but his eyes never left the burning cabin. Jennifer could see the pain in his face as he watched years of careful work reduced to ash and ember. This had been his sanctuary too, his refuge from a world that had marked him as surely as her scars had marked her. They backed away from the ridge, moving carefully through the trees until they were out of sight of the raiders. Only then did Lionel allow himself to show the full extent of his fury. Sons of bitches, he said, his voice shaking with rage. They had no right. What do we do now? Jennifer asked. Lionel was quiet for a long moment, his mind clearly working through their limited options. They had the clothes on their backs, the supplies in his saddlebags, and the weapons he carried. Everything else was burning in the cabin they could no longer approach. We go to ground, he said finally. Find somewhere to hole up while we figure out our next move. Where? I know a place. An old mining camp about 10 miles north of here. Been abandoned for years, but the buildings are still standing. They rode through the afternoon, following game trails and creek beds that would hide their tracks from pursuit. The abandoned mining camp sat in a narrow valley surrounded by steep cliffs, accessible only through a single narrow pass that could be easily defended. The buildings were weathered and worn, charming coin, but structurally sound. A few miners' shacks, a collapsed stamp mill, and a larger building that might have served as a store or meeting hall. It was not much, but it would provide shelter while they decided what to do next. Lionel chose the largest building for their base, checking the roof and walls for damage before bringing Jennifer inside. The interior was dusty and filled with the detritus of long-departed miners, but it was dry and defensible. Quote 606, he said, already planning improvements. Quote 670, Jennifer looked around the abandoned building and tried to imagine it as a home. It seemed impossible after the warmth and comfort of the cabin, but she had learned to adapt to worse circumstances. Quote 608, she asked. Quote 609, quote 610, while Lionel began unloading their supplies, his movements sharp and efficient. Quote 611. It was not much of a plan, but Jennifer could see no alternative. They were outnumbered and outgunned, with no legal recourse against men who believed they were acting in her best interests. Their only hope was to outlast their pursuers, to prove that they could not be easily broken or driven apart. As night fell, they made the abandoned building as comfortable as possible. Lionel started a small fire in the old stove, carefully managing the smoke to avoid detection. Jennifer arranged their bedding in the corner, farthest from the windows, creating a nest of blankets and furs that would provide warmth and security. They ate a cold supper of dried meat and hardtack, washing it down with water from Lionel's canteen. It was a far cry from the comfortable meals they had shared in the cabin, but Jennifer found herself grateful for even this simple sustenance. "Do you regret it?" she asked as they prepared for sleep. "Marrying me, I mean. If you had not, you would still have your cabin." Lionel looked at her across the small fire, his blue eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "If I had not married you, Foster would have taken you back to Cedar Ridge. You would be trapped there, under the control of people who see you as damaged goods." "That does not answer my question." "No," he said firmly. "I do not regret it. The cabin was just a building. You are my life now." Jennifer felt warmth spread through her chest, a glow that had nothing to do with the fire. Even in these desperate circumstances, even with their future uncertain and dangerous, she felt lucky to have found this man who valued her above his own comfort and safety. They lay down together on the makeshift bed, sharing warmth and comfort in the cold mountain night. Outside, the wind howled through the abandoned camp, but inside their shelter, Jennifer felt safe in the circle of Lionel's arms. Quote 618, she asked. Quote 619, quote 620, quote 621. Jennifer closed her eyes and listened to the steady rhythm of Lionel's breathing. She thought about the 7 scars that marked her face, each one a story of survival against impossible odds. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats to the life they were trying to build together. But tonight she was exactly where she belonged, in the arms of a man who saw her scars as proof of her strength, who had chosen to stand with her against a world that wanted to tear them apart. The fire burned low and finally died, leaving them in darkness. But Jennifer was not afraid of the dark anymore. She had found her light, her anchor, her home, and no one was going to take it away from her. Dawn came gray and cold, with fresh snow beginning to fall as Jennifer woke in Lionel's arms. The abandoned mining camp looked even more desolate in the pale morning light, but she felt a strange sense of hope as she watched her husband move around their temporary shelter, checking their defenses and planning their day. He said, examining their meager stores. Lionel had identified a small settlement called Pine Creek about 15 miles to the east, far enough from Millfield to avoid Foster's immediate attention, but close enough to reach in a day's ride. It was a risk, but they could not survive the winter on what they had. Quote Wow 626, he said. Quote Wow 627. Quote Wow 628. Jennifer's voice was firm. "We stay together. I will not be separated from you again." Lionel started to argue, then saw the determination in her eyes and nodded. Together then, but we need to be smart about it. Change our appearance, pay cash, do not linger. They spent the morning preparing for the journey. Lionel trimmed his beard and pulled his hat low over his eyes, while Jennifer wrapped a scarf around her face to hide her scars. It was not much of a disguise, but it might be enough to avoid immediate recognition. The ride to Pine Creek took them through country that was wild and beautiful, untouched by the violence that had driven them from their home. Jennifer found herself thinking about the contrast between the peace of the wilderness and the ugliness of human conflict, wondering why men like Foster could not simply leave others alone to live their lives. Pine Creek was little more than a trading post with a few scattered buildings, but it had what they needed. Lionel negotiated carefully with the storekeeper, buying supplies in small quantities to avoid suspicion: food, ammunition, basic tools, and warm clothing for the winter ahead. As they loaded their purchases onto Buck's back, Jennifer noticed a man watching them from across the street. He was tall and lean, with the weathered look of someone who spent his life outdoors. Something about his attention made her nervous. Quote 631, she said quietly. He followed her gaze and tensed slightly. Quote 632. The stranger approached them with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Quote 633. Jennifer felt her heart sink. They had been found already, their careful disguises useless against someone who knew what to look for. Quote 634. Lionel replied cautiously. Quote 635. Morrison's eyes flicked to Jennifer's scarf-wrapped face. Quote 636 or quote 637, Lionel said. Morrison smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Quote 638. Jennifer realized they had made a fatal mistake. The coins she had saved from her wages at Foster's store bore the mark of the bank where Foster did his business. It was a connection they should have anticipated. Lots of banks use similar coins, Lionel said, but his hand was moving slowly toward his gun. Maybe so, Morrison agreed, but I think I will ask the lady to remove that scarf so I can get a proper look at her face. The moment stretched out like a wire pulled tight, three people standing in the street with the weight of decision hanging between them. Jennifer could see other townspeople beginning to take notice, could feel the situation spiraling toward violence. Miss Lewis, Morrison said, his voice carrying the authority of his badge. I know it is you. There is no point in pretending otherwise. Jennifer looked at Lionel, saw the calculation in his eyes as he measured distances and angles. Morrison was young and confident, but Lionel was a veteran of real war, not just frontier law enforcement. If it came to gunplay, she had no doubt who would win. But winning would make them fugitives, wanted for killing a lawman. It would mean a life on the run, always looking over their shoulders, never able to settle anywhere for long. Wait, she said, stepping between the two men. There is no need for violence. She unwrapped the scarf from her face, revealing the scars that marked her as surely as a brand. Morrison nodded with satisfaction, his hand relaxing on his gun. Jennifer Lewis, he said. Or should I say Jennifer Reed? I heard about your marriage yesterday. Congratulations. Thank you. Of course, there are some folks who think that marriage might not be entirely legal. Seems there are questions about your mental competence to make such decisions. Jennifer felt anger flare in her chest. I am perfectly competent. Maybe so, but that is for a judge to decide. You need to come with me, ma'am. There are people worried about your welfare. My welfare is fine. Living in the wilderness with a stranger, running from people who care about you, does not sound fine to me. Lionel stepped forward, his voice deadly quiet. The lady has made her choice. She does not want to go with you. Morrison's hand moved back to his gun. Quote 655. Quote 656. Jennifer demanded. Morrison produced a folded paper from his coat pocket. Quote 657. Jennifer scanned the document, her heart sinking as she read the legal language that reduced her to the status of a potentially incompetent person in need of protection. Foster had moved quickly, using his influence and connections to get the law on his side. She said. Morrison agreed. Quote 661. Jennifer felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. If their marriage could be challenged, if she could be declared incompetent, then all their struggles would be for nothing. Foster would win, and she would spend the rest of her life under the control of people who saw her as damaged goods, Lionel said firmly. Quote Taxdora Morrison gestured toward his horse. Quote Sarah, Jennifer looked around the small settlement, noting the curious faces watching from doorways and windows. She was trapped, caught between the law that Foster had manipulated and the violence that would only make things worse. Quote 665, she said carefully. George Chadden, quote Hester, quote eyes, Lionel growled. Morrison's eyes hardened. You want to make this difficult, mountain man? I can arrest you for interfering with a lawful order, resisting a peace officer, maybe even kidnapping. On what evidence? The evidence of a scared woman who was taken from a stage wreck and held against her will. It was a lie, but Jennifer could see how easily it could be made to sound convincing. A scarred woman, vulnerable and alone, rescued by a mountain man who took advantage of her gratitude. It was exactly the kind of story that would confirm people's worst assumptions about both of them. She said. Jennifer felt despair wash over her. No matter what she said, no matter how she protested, her words would be dismissed as the confused ramblings of a damaged mind. Foster had constructed a perfect trap, using her own scars against her as evidence of mental instability. Quote 674, she said. Morrison shrugged. Quote 675. Jennifer pulled Lionel aside, lowering her voice so the deputy could not overhear. Quote 676, quote 677, quote 678, quote 679. Jennifer took his hands in hers, feeling the calloused string that had pulled her from so many dangers. Lionel's jaw was tight with frustration. I do not trust lawyers and courts. I trust my rifle and my ability to protect what is mine. And I trust you to find another way, a way that does not make us fugitives. She could see him struggling with the decision, every instinct telling him to fight while his rational mind recognized the trap they were in. Finally, he nodded reluctantly. How do I find you? He asked. They will take me to Millfield for the hearing. Be there. Find a way to help me prove that our marriage is real and that I am competent to make my own decisions. And if I cannot, Jennifer touched his face, her fingers tracing the small scar on his forehead. Then you will have to accept that we tried, that we had something real, even if it was only for a little while. Lionel caught her hand and pressed it against his cheek. I love you, Jennifer Reed. I love you too, Lionel Reed. Morrison cleared his throat impatiently. Time is up, folks. Jennifer kissed her husband one last time, tasting salt tears on his lips. Then she walked to Morrison's horse and allowed him to help her mount behind him. As they rode away from Pine Creek, Jennifer looked back to see Lionel standing in the street, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He looked like a man watching his world burn, and Jennifer felt her heart break for the pain she was causing him. But this was the only way. Violence would only prove Foster's point, that she was incapable of making rational decisions. If they were going to win this fight, it had to be on legal ground, using the law that Foster thought he had turned against them. The ride to Millfield took the rest of the day, and Jennifer spent the hours planning her defense. She was not the helpless victim Foster wanted to portray. She was an educated woman who had supported herself for years, who had survived disasters and dangers that would have broken weaker people. Her scars were not evidence of mental instability. They were proof of her strength, her refusal to give up when life tried to destroy her. And her marriage to Lionel was not the desperate act of a confused mind, but the deliberate choice of a woman who had finally found someone who valued her for who she truly was. The question was whether she could convince a judge of that, whether the legal system would see past her scars to the person underneath, or whether Foster's influence would carry the day. As they approached Millfield, Jennifer saw smoke rising from several chimneys and realized that word of her capture had already spread. People were gathering to witness her return, to see the scarred woman who had caused such a stir by choosing love over convention. Morrison rode straight to the jail, a small stone building next to the courthouse. He helped Jennifer down from his horse and escorted her inside, his hand firm but not rough on her arm. Quote 692, he said as he opened a cell door. Quote 693. Jennifer stepped into the small cell, noting the clean straw on the floor and the blanket folded on the narrow cot. It was not luxurious, but it was not cruel either. Morrison was just doing his job, following orders from men who thought they knew what was best for everyone. She asked. Morrison shrugged. Quote 699. The deputy left her alone in the cell, and Jennifer sat on the cot to think. Tomorrow would determine the course of the rest of her life. Either she would convince the judge that she was competent and her marriage was valid, or she would be placed under Foster's guardianship and forced to live the life he thought she should have. But she was not giving up. She had 7 scars, 7 stories of survival against impossible odds. Tomorrow would just be another story, another test of her strength and determination. And somewhere out in the mountains, Lionel was planning his own strategy. She had faith in him, in his intelligence and resourcefulness. Together, they would find a way to win this fight. They had to, because the alternative was unthinkable. The hearing was scheduled for 10 o'clock the following morning, but Jennifer was awake long before dawn, pacing the small cell and rehearsing her arguments. She had to be perfect, had to present herself as a rational, competent woman who had made informed decisions about her own life. The appointed lawyer arrived at 8 o'clock, a young man named David Chen, who looked barely old enough to practice law. He was nervous and apologetic, clearly overwhelmed by the complexity of the case. "Miss Lewis," he said, settling into a chair outside her cell, "I have reviewed the documents, and I must tell you that the situation is quite challenging." "How challenging?" "Mr. Foster has presented evidence that you have a history of erratic behavior. Leaving your job without notice, disappearing from a stagecoach, living unmarried with a man in the wilderness." Jennifer felt her heart sink. Those are not signs of mental instability. They are signs of a woman making choices about her own life. Perhaps, but the law gives considerable weight to the testimony of respectable citizens who claim to be acting in your best interests. "And what about my testimony? Does that count for nothing?" Chen shifted uncomfortably. "The court will consider your statements, of course, but given the questions about your mental state, your testimony may be given less weight than that of the witnesses." It was exactly what Jennifer had feared. The legal system was designed to protect people like Foster, respectable men who claimed to know what was best for women like her. Her own voice, her own choices, would be dismissed as the confused ramblings of a damaged mind. "What about my marriage?" she asked. "Does that not give me legal standing?" "That is another problem," Chen admitted. "Pastor Williams has signed an affidavit stating that he has concerns about the circumstances of the ceremony. He says you seem distressed and possibly coerced." Jennifer stared at the young lawyer in disbelief. "Pastor Williams married us willingly. He asked all the proper questions and was satisfied with our answers. He says he has had time to reflect and now believes he may have acted hastily." It was clear that Foster had gotten to the pastor either through pressure or persuasion. Jennifer wondered what threats or promises had been used to make a man of God betray his own conscience. "So what are my options?" she asked. Chen consulted his notes, clearly uncomfortable with the answer he had to give. "The court could declare your marriage invalid and place you under the guardianship of Mr. Foster. Or, if you are found competent, you could be required to undergo a period of supervised living to demonstrate your ability to make rational decisions." "Supervised by whom?" "Mr. Foster has volunteered to provide such supervision." Jennifer laughed bitterly. It was a perfect trap. Either she was declared incompetent and placed under Foster's control, or she was declared competent but still placed under Foster's control. There was no option that allowed her to return to her husband and the life they had built together. "There is one other possibility," Chen said hesitantly. "What?" "If your husband were to appear and demonstrate that he is a suitable guardian, the court might be willing to recognize your marriage and place you under his supervision instead. And if he does not appear, then I am afraid your options are quite limited." Jennifer closed her eyes and tried to think. Lionel was somewhere out there, probably planning some desperate rescue attempt that would only make things worse. She needed to find a way to contact him, to let him know what was happening and how he could help. "Can I send a message?" she asked. "To whom?" "My husband. He should know about the hearing." Chen shook his head. "I'm sorry, but you are not allowed to communicate with anyone outside the jail until after the hearing." Another trap designed to keep her isolated and helpless. Foster had thought of everything, covering every angle to ensure his victory. At 9:30, Morrison came to escort her to the courthouse. Jennifer had done her best to make herself presentable, smoothing her hair and straightening her dress, but she knew that her scars would dominate any impression she made on the judge. The courthouse was packed with curious townspeople who had come to witness the spectacle. Jennifer recognized some faces from her brief time in Millfield, but most were strangers drawn by the drama of a scarred woman fighting for her freedom. Judge Hamilton was an elderly man with white hair and stern eyes that seemed to have already decided her fate. He took his seat at the bench and called the hearing to order with the authority of someone accustomed to absolute power. We are here today to determine the mental competence of Jennifer Lewis and the validity of her recent marriage to one Lionel Reed, he announced. Mr. Foster, you may present your case. Foster rose from his seat at the prosecutor's table, his face grave with manufactured concern. Quote 729, and he went on to detail Jennifer's supposed crimes against propriety: leaving her job without notice, disappearing from the stagecoach, living unmarried with a stranger in the wilderness. Each action was presented as evidence of a mind that had lost its ability to make rational decisions. Pastor Williams was called as a witness, his face pale with shame as he testified that he now had doubts about the marriage ceremony he had performed. I fear I may have been too hasty, he said. The couple seemed desperate, almost frantic. I should have insisted on a longer period of reflection. Jennifer wanted to stand up and scream at the lies being told about her, but Chen had warned her to remain silent until called upon. The legal system moved at its own pace, following its own rules, and any outburst would only confirm the image of an unstable woman. Samuel Brooks testified about Jennifer's financial irresponsibility, claiming that she had abandoned steady employment for the uncertain life of a mountain woman. Quote 732, he declared. Even Marcus Webb was called to testify about the circumstances of Jennifer's capture, painting a picture of a confused woman who had been manipulated by a dangerous mountain man. She seemed grateful to be rescued, he lied, like someone who had been held against her will but was afraid to say so. Each witness added another layer to the narrative Foster was constructing, the story of a damaged woman who had lost her ability to think clearly. By the time they were finished, Jennifer felt as if she had been transformed from a person into a problem, a burden that needed to be managed by wiser heads. Miss Lewis, Judge Hamilton said finally, you may now speak in your own defense. Jennifer stood on shaking legs, knowing that this might be her only chance to tell her side of the story. She looked out at the packed courtroom, at the face that ranged from curious to hostile to pitying. Your Honor, she began, her voice steady despite her fear. I am not the helpless victim these men have described. I am a woman who has survived tragedy and hardship, who has learned to take care of herself and make her own decisions. She touched the largest scar on her face, feeling the familiar ridge of tissue. These scars tell the story of a carriage accident that killed my parents when I was 16. I could have given up then, could have let grief and pain destroy me. Instead, I learned to be independent. Jennifer went on to describe her years of work, her careful management of her own affairs, her decision to leave Cedar Ridge when she realized she would never be accepted there. I chose to go to Denver to start a new life. That is not the action of an incompetent person, but of someone taking control of her own destiny. She described the stagecoach accident, the blizzard, the wolf attack, and Lionel's rescue. Judge Hamilton asked. Jennifer said simply. She sat down knowing that she had said everything she could. Now it was up to the judge to decide whether her words carried more weight than Foster's lies. Judge Hamilton was quiet for a long moment, studying the papers before him. This is indeed a difficult case, he said finally. The court must balance the rights of an individual to make her own choices against the responsibility to protect those who may not be capable of making rational decisions. Jennifer held her breath, waiting for the verdict that would determine the rest of her life. However, the judge continued, before I render my decision, I would like to hear from the man in question. Mr. Reed, if you are present, please come forward. Jennifer's heart leaped as she saw Lionel rise from the back of the courtroom. He had been there all along, listening to the lies and distortions, waiting for his chance to speak. He walked to the front of the room with the same quiet confidence he brought to everything, his presence commanding attention despite his simple clothes and weathered appearance. Quote, 750, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the packed room. Lionel looked directly at the judge, his blue eyes steady and unafraid. Got 7 by 3. He turned to look at Jennifer, and she saw love and pride shining in his face. Quote 754 Manai, quote 75 by quote 756. Lionel's voice grew stronger, more passionate. Every scar tells a story of survival, of a woman who has faced the worst and emerged stronger. That is not mental illness, Your Honor. That is heroism. The courtroom was completely silent, every person hanging on Lionel's words. Jennifer felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she listened to her husband defend not just their marriage, but her very worth as a human being. Quote 758. Lionel continued. Quote 759. He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. Quote 760 Bond. Jennifer stared in amazement. She had no memory of seeing a doctor in Denver, but somehow Lionel had found evidence to support her case. Lionel said, producing more papers. Quote 762. He handed the documents to Judge Hamilton, who examined them carefully. Jennifer could see the judge's expression changing as he read, doubt creeping into his stern features. These are serious allegations, Mr. Reed. Are you claiming that the previous witnesses perjured themselves? I am claiming that they saw only what they expected to see, Lionel replied. A scarred woman must be damaged goods. A woman choosing an unconventional life must be mentally unstable. They could not conceive that she might be making rational decisions that simply do not conform to their expectations. Judge Hamilton set down the papers and looked out at the packed courtroom. This case has raised important questions about the rights of individuals to make their own choices, even when those choices are unconventional. He paused, and Jennifer could feel the tension in the room like a physical force. After careful consideration of all the evidence presented, the judge said finally, I find that Jennifer Reed is mentally competent and capable of making her own decisions. Furthermore, I find that her marriage to Lionel Reed is valid and legally binding. Jennifer felt her knees go weak with relief. She had won. Against all odds, against Foster's influence and the prejudices of the legal system, she had won the right to choose her own life. But Judge Hamilton was not finished. He continued. Jennifer's heart sank. Even in victory, she was not free. This supervision will be conducted by her husband, Lionel Reed, who will report to the court quarterly on her condition and behavior. It was not perfect, but it was better than she had dared hope. She would be free to return to Lionel, to rebuild their life together, even if it meant living under the watchful eye of the court. Foster rose from his seat, his face dark with anger. Your Honor, I respectfully request that you reconsider. Placing Miss Lewis under the supervision of the very man who may have influenced her poor decisions seems counterproductive. Your request is noted and denied, Judge Hamilton replied firmly. The court has made its decision. The hearing was over, but Jennifer knew that her troubles were not. Foster would not accept this defeat gracefully, and she could see in his eyes the promise of future conflict. But for now, she was free to go home with her husband. Lionel helped her to her feet, his strong hands steadying her as the reaction to the stress finally hit. Are you all right? He asked quietly. I am now, she said. They walked out of the courthouse together, ignoring the stares and whispers of the crowd. Jennifer felt the weight of judgment still pressing down on her, but it no longer had the power to crush her. She had faced the worst the legal system could throw at her and emerged victorious. Outside, Lionel had Buck waiting, along with a pack horse loaded with supplies. I thought we might need to leave quickly, he explained. Where will we go? Jennifer asked. The cabin is gone. Lionel smiled, and she saw hope shining in his blue eyes. I know a place, a valley about 50 miles north of here, good water and shelter. We can build something new there, something better, something ours. They mounted up and rode out of Millfield, leaving behind the courthouse and the jail and the people who had tried to control their destiny. The road ahead was uncertain, but they would travel it together. As they climbed into the mountains, Jennifer thought about the 7 scars that marked her face. Each one told a story of survival, of refusing to give up when the world tried to break her. Today had added another story, another proof of her strength. She was Jennifer Reed now, wife of a mountain man, free to choose her own path. It was not the life she had planned, but it was the life she had fought for. And it was enough. The valley Lionel had spoken of lay hidden in the heart of the mountains, accessible only through a narrow pass that could be easily defended. Jennifer gasped when she saw it for the first time, a perfect bowl of meadow and forest surrounded by towering peaks that seemed to touch the squiffing. "It is beautiful," she breathed. "It is ours," Lionel replied. "I filed a homestead claim on it 3 years ago, but never had reason to build here until now." They made camp beside a clear stream that ran through the center of the valley, the water so pure Jennifer could see trout swimming in the depths. The meadow was covered with snow now, but she could imagine how it would look in spring, carpeted with wildflowers and thick grass. "We will build the cabin there," Lionel said, pointing to a rise of ground that commanded a view of the entire valley. Close enough to the stream for water, high enough to stay dry in the spring floods. Jennifer could see it in her mind's eye, a home built with their own hands from the timber that surrounded them. Not just a shelter, but a symbol of their determination to create something lasting from the ashes of their separate pasts. They spent the winter months in a temporary shelter, working together to fell trees and prepare timber for the cabin they would build in spring. It was hard work, but Jennifer found herself growing stronger with each passing day. Her hands, once soft from indoor work, became calloused and capable. Her body, once weak from too little food and too much worry, grew lean and tough. Lionel taught her everything he knew about mountain living: how to read the weather in the shape of clouds and the behavior of animals, how to hunt and trap and preserve meat for the lean months, how to find edible plants and medicinal herbs in the forest, how to defend their home against both animal and human threats. In return, Jennifer brought her own skills to their partnership. She could read and write, skills that were valuable even in the wilderness. She could cook and sew and manage their household with the efficiency of someone who had learned to make do with little. Most importantly, she could plan and organize, thinking ahead to anticipate their needs. As winter gave way to spring, they began work on the cabin. It would be larger than Lionel's old home, with 2 rooms and a proper stone fireplace. They worked from dawn to dusk, their hands bleeding and their backs aching, but Jennifer had never been happier. This was what she had been searching for without knowing it. Not just a place to live, but a purpose. Not just acceptance, but partnership. Not just survival, but the chance to build something meaningful with someone who valued her for who she truly was. One evening, as they sat by their campfire planning the next day's work, Lionel asked about her scars again. It had become a ritual between them, the slow sharing of stories that had shaped their lives. "Quote 788, he said, pointing to a small mark near her ear. Jennifer touched the spot, remembering. "Quote 789, quote 790 on, quote 791 off." Lionel nodded, understanding the deeper meaning. "Quote 792, quote 793. They had shared 6 stories now, 6 of the 7 scars that marked her face. Only one remained, the smallest, but perhaps most significant. Jennifer was not ready to tell that story yet, but she knew that someday she would. When the time was right, when she was ready to reveal the deepest wound her heart had ever carried. Spring brought visitors to their valley. Thomas and Jessica Green, fully recovered from their ordeal, came to thank Lionel for saving their lives and to see how Jennifer was faring. They brought news from the outside world, including word that George Foster had been arrested for arson in connection with the burning of Lionel's cabin. "Seems someone saw him and his men leaving the scene," Thomas explained. "He is claiming it was an accident, but the evidence suggests otherwise." Jennifer felt a fierce satisfaction at the news. Foster had finally overplayed his hand, letting his anger and frustration drive him to actions that even his influence could not excuse. "What about the charges against us?" she asked. "Dropped," Jessica said with a smile. "Judge Hamilton reviewed the case after Foster's arrest and concluded that you were the victims, not the criminals." It was vindication, but Jennifer found that she cared less about legal recognition than she had expected. What mattered was not what the law said about her marriage, but the daily reality of the life she and Lionel were building together. Other visitors followed as word spread about the couple who had defied convention to find happiness in the mountains. Some came out of curiosity, others seeking the same kind of freedom Jennifer and Lionel had found. A few even decided to settle in the area, creating a small community of people who had chosen independence over conformity. Pastor Williams came in late summer, his face heavy with shame as he asked Jennifer's forgiveness for his betrayal. Quote 799, he admitted. Quote 800. Jennifer looked at the broken man before her and felt pity rather than anger. Quote 801, she said gently. Quote 80. The pastor wept at her words, and Jennifer realized that forgiveness was not just a gift she gave to others, but a freedom she claimed for herself. Holding on to anger and resentment would only poison the happiness she had found. As autumn painted the valley in shades of gold and crimson, Jennifer and Lagonal celebrated their first wedding anniversary. The cabin was finished now, complete with glass windows and a front porch that looked out over the meadow. It was not grand by the standards of the cities, but it was theirs. They had invited their friends for a celebration, and the cabin was filled with laughter and music as people shared food and stories around the big table Lionel had built from pine logs. Jennifer looked around at the faces of people who had become family, people who saw past her scars to the person underneath. Desolate 803, someone called out, and the others took up the cry. Jennifer stood, feeling suddenly shy despite the friendly faces surrounding her. Quote 804, she began. Quote 8, she looked at Lionel, who was watching her with pride and devotion shining in his blue eyes. Quote 8, how the room was quiet now, everyone listening intently to her words. Quote 807, Jennifer continued, her voice growing stronger. Quote 808, she touched the smallest scar, a tiny mark at the corner of her mouth that was barely visible unless you knew where to look. Quote 809, she said quietly. Quote 810. The words hung in the air like a confession, raw and honest and painful. Jennifer could see the shock on some faces, the understanding in others. Quote 801. She looked around the room, meeting each person's eyes. That tiny scar reminds me every day that I chose to live, that even in my darkest moment, I found the strength to keep going. Jennifer reached for Lionel's hand, feeling his fingers close around hers with gentle strength. Good 813 awe. The room erupted in applause, and Jennifer felt tears streaming down her cheeks. She had told her deepest secret, shared her most shameful moment, and been met with acceptance and love. Later, after the guests had gone home and they were alone by the fire, Lionel traced each of her scars with gentle fingers. He said quietly, quote 815 to quote 816. Lionel kissed her then, tasting salt tears and sweet wine and the promise of all the years they would have together. Outside, the wind sang through the pines and snow began to fall. But inside their cabin, Jennifer felt only warmth and safety and the deep contentment of a woman who had finally found her home. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, from the carriage accident that had killed her parents to the stage wreck that had delivered her into Lionel's arms. Every scar, every struggle, every moment of despair had been leading to this place, this life, this love. The mirror in their bedroom showed the same 7 scars it always had, but Jennifer no longer saw them as marks of damage. They were her history, written in flesh and bone, the story of a woman who had refused to surrender even when the world told her she was worthless. And in Lionel's eyes, she saw the reflection of who she truly was. Not a scarred woman to be pitied or managed, but a survivor, a fighter, a woman worthy of love and respect and the freedom to choose her own path. The fire burned low in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls of the home they had built together. Jennifer curled up in her husband's arms, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, and felt the deep peace of someone who had finally stopped running from her past. She had 7 scars, 7 stories of survival, and now she had an 8th story, the most important one of all. The story of how a scarred woman and a damaged man had found each other in the wilderness and built a love that could withstand any storm. It was a story worth telling, worth living, worth fighting for. And it was just the beginning. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing their valley in pristine white. But inside the cabin, wrapped in the warmth of love and acceptance, Jennifer Reed slept without dreams, secure in the knowledge that she was exactly where she belonged. The mountain man had traced each of her scars and found them beautiful, and in doing so, he had helped her discover the truth she had been searching for all her life. She was not damaged goods. She was not a burden to be managed or a problem to be solved. She was a woman with 7 stories of survival, and each one had made her stronger. Spring came early to the valley that second year, bringing with it news from the outside world that would test Jennifer and Lionel's hard-won peace. A letter arrived with the mail delivery, carried by a rider who made the dangerous journey through the mountain passes once a month. The letter was from David Chen, the young lawyer who had represented Jennifer at her competency hearing. His news was troubling. George Foster had been released from prison after serving only 6 months for arson, his sentence reduced through the influence of powerful friends who believed his claims of acting in Jennifer's best interests. "He is telling people that you were coerced into making false statements," Chen wrote, "that your husband has isolated you from civilization and convinced you to reject the help of people who care about you. There is talk of organizing another legal challenge to your marriage." Jennifer read the letter aloud to Lionel as they sat on their front porch, watching the sun set behind the mountains. The words filled her with a familiar dread, the old fear of being dragged back into a world that refused to accept her choices. "He will never give up," she said quietly. Lionel was silent for a long moment, his jaw tight with controlled anger. "Then we need to make sure he understands the consequences of continuing this harassment." "What do you mean?" "I mean it is time to stop running and start fighting back." Jennifer looked at her husband, noting the hard edge that had crept into his voice. She had seen glimpses of the soldier he had once been, but this was different. This was the cold calculation of a man who had decided that diplomacy had failed. "What are you planning?" she asked. "A visit to Cedar Ridge, to have a conversation with Mr. Foster about the wisdom of leaving us alone." The idea terrified Jennifer, not because she feared for Lionel's safety, but because she knew what such a confrontation might cost him. If he hurt Foster, or even threatened him too explicitly, he could be arrested and imprisoned. She would lose him just as surely as if Foster's legal maneuvering succeeded. "There has to be another way," she said. "What other way? We have tried legal channels and they have failed. We have tried hiding and he has found us. What is left except to make him understand that some fights are not worth winning?" Jennifer understood his frustration, shared his anger at Foster's relentless persecution, but she also knew that violence would only give their enemies more ammunition to use against them. Quote 827, she said. Quote 828. That night, as Lionel slept beside her, Jennifer lay awake staring at the ceiling and trying to find a solution that would end Foster's harassment without destroying the life they had built. The answer, when it came to her, was so simple she wondered why she had not thought of it before. The next morning, she shared her plan with Lionel over breakfast. "What if we go public with our story, really public? Newspapers, magazines, anyone who will listen." Lionel frowned. "You want to invite more attention." "I want to control the narrative. Right now, Foster gets to tell his version of events to sympathetic audiences. People hear about the poor scarred woman who was kidnapped by a mountain man, and they feel sorry for her. But what if they heard the real story?" Jennifer warmed to her theme as she spoke, seeing the possibilities unfold. What if they heard about a woman who survived a carriage accident that killed her parents, who worked for years to support herself, who was fired from her job because her scars made customers uncomfortable? And then she was rescued from a stage wreck by a man who saw her scars as proof of her strength rather than evidence of her damage. A man who offered her a place where she could belong, where she could be valued for who she truly was. Lionel was quiet for a moment, considering the implications. It is risky. Once the story is out there, we cannot control how people interpret it. But we can make sure they hear our version first. And if enough people know the truth, it becomes harder for Foster to spread his lies. The plan required careful execution. Jennifer would write her own account of their story, starting with the carriage accident that had scarred her and ending with their marriage and the life they had built together. She would be honest about the hardships, the doubts, the moments of fear and uncertainty. But she would also emphasize the love they had found, the partnership they had forged, the happiness they had discovered in choosing their own path. Lionel would provide supporting details, his perspective as the man who had rescued her from the wolves and offered her a new life. Together, they would create a narrative that was both compelling and true, a story that would resonate with anyone who had ever felt like an outsider or struggled to find acceptance. They spent weeks crafting the account, writing and rewriting until every word was perfect. Jennifer drew on her education to create prose that was both accessible and moving, while Lionel contributed his practical knowledge of mountain life and survival. When they were satisfied with their work, they sent copies to newspapers in Denver, Colorado Springs, and even as far away as San Francisco and New York. They included photographs that Lionel had commissioned from a traveling photographer, images that showed Jennifer's scars clearly, but also captured the happiness and confidence she had found in her new life. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Editors who had initially been skeptical were won over by the honesty and power of Jennifer's story. Within weeks, their account was being reprinted in newspapers across the country, accompanied by editorials that praised their courage and condemned those who would deny them the right to choose their own destiny. A love story written in scars, read one headline. Mountain Bride defies convention to find happiness, proclaimed another. The coverage was not uniformly positive, but it was extensive, and it presented their side of the story in terms that even skeptics could understand. Letters began arriving at their remote valley, forwarded by the Postal Service from the various newspapers that had published their story. Most were supportive, from people who had been moved by their account and wanted to express their admiration. Some were from other women who had faced similar challenges, who found hope in Jennifer's example of refusing to accept society's limitations. A few letters were hostile from people who believed that Jennifer should have accepted Foster's guidance rather than choosing what they saw as a scandalous life. But even these served a purpose, demonstrating the narrow-mindedness that had driven Jennifer from civilization in the first place. The most important letter came from Judge Hamilton, who had presided over Jennifer's competency hearing. He wrote to express his satisfaction with the outcome of the case and to officially terminate the court's supervision of their marriage. He wrote, quote, 840. The legal cloud that had hung over their marriage was finally lifted, but Jennifer found that she cared less about official recognition than she had expected. What mattered was not what judges and newspapers said about their love, but the daily reality of the life they were living together. Summer brought more visitors to their valley, drawn by the publicity surrounding their story. Some were curiosity seekers who wanted to gawk at the famous scarred woman and her mountain man husband. But others were people seeking the same kind of freedom Jennifer and Lionel had found. Refugees from conventional society who were inspired by their example. Among the visitors was a young woman named Sarah Mitchell, who bore facial scars from a factory fire and had been told by her family that she would never find a husband. She arrived at their cabin with tears in her eyes and hope in her heart, carrying a worn copy of the newspaper article that had told Jennifer's story. "I read about you," she said simply, "and I thought maybe there was hope for someone like me too." Jennifer welcomed Sarah into their home, sharing her own story in greater detail and helping the young woman understand that scars did not define her worth. Over the course of a week-long visit, Sarah's confidence grew visibly as she realized that she was not alone in her struggles. Sarah said as she prepared to leave, quote 844, watching Sarah ride away with new purpose and determination, Jennifer realized that their story had become something larger than their personal journey. It had become a beacon for others who felt damaged or unworthy. Proof that happiness and love were possible, even for those who bore visible reminders of life's cruelties. The publicity also brought unexpected consequences. Publishers approached Jennifer about writing a book based on their story, offering substantial sums for the rights to expand her newspaper account into a full-length memoir. At first, she was reluctant to expose their private life to even more scrutiny. But Lionel convinced her to consider the opportunity. "Think of all the women like Sarah who could benefit from reading your story," he said. "Think of the men who might learn to see scars differently because of what you write." Jennifer agreed to write the book, but on her own terms. She would tell their story honestly, without sensationalizing the hardships or romanticizing the challenges they had faced. She would emphasize the practical aspects of building a life together, the daily choices and compromises that made their partnership work. The book, titled 7 Scars, A Mountain Love Story, was published the following year to critical acclaim and commercial success. It became particularly popular among women who saw in Jennifer's journey a reflection of their own struggles for independence and self-determination. More importantly, the book's success gave Jennifer and Lionel financial security that allowed them to expand their homestead and help other couples who wanted to follow their example. They established a small settlement in their valley, welcoming people who had been rejected by conventional society for various reasons. There was Marcus Webb, the former deputy who had lost his leg in a mining accident and been dismissed from his job. There was Elena Rodriguez, a Mexican woman whose mixed heritage made her unwelcome in many communities. There was James Thompson, a former slave who had come west seeking freedom from the prejudices of the post-war South. Each person brought their own skills and stories to the growing community, creating a diverse group bound together by their shared experience of being outsiders. Jennifer found herself becoming an unofficial leader, helping to resolve disputes and organize the practical aspects of their collective life. "You have built something remarkable here," Pastor Williams said during one of his visits to the valley. The minister had become a regular guest, drawn by the community's spirit of acceptance and mutual support. Quote 849. Jennifer looked around at the thriving settlement, at the gardens and workshops and homes that had grown up around their original cabin. Children played in the meadow, their laughter echoing off the surrounding peaks. Adults worked together on projects that benefited the entire community, sharing skills and resources without regard for traditional social hierarchies. Quote 850, she said simply. Quote 851. The success of their community attracted attention from government officials and social reformers who were interested in studying their unconventional approach to settlement and governance. Some came as critics, expecting to find caste in immorality. Instead, they found a well-organized society that had achieved remarkable prosperity through cooperation and mutual respect. One visitor was particularly significant, Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell, the first woman to receive a medical degree in the United States. She had read Jennifer's book and wanted to meet the woman who had turned her scars into a source of strength. "You have accomplished something extraordinary," Dr. Blackwell said as she toured their settlement, "not just in your personal life, but in creating a model for how society might treat those who are different." Jennifer was honored by the praise, but she remained focused on the practical work of building their community. There were always new challenges to face, new people seeking refuge, new problems requiring creative solutions. The most significant challenge came in their 5th year, when a group of investors attempted to claim their valley for a mining operation. They arrived with legal documents and armed guards, declaring that the homestead claims were invalid and that the settlers had no right to the land. It was Foster's revenge, Jennifer realized. Unable to reclaim her through legal means, he had found other ways to strike at their happiness. The mining company was backed by his money and influence, another attempt to drive them from the life they had chosen. But this time, Jennifer and Lionel were not alone. Their community had grown to include more than 50 families, people who had invested their lives and labor in the valley. They had resources, connections, and most importantly, the determination to fight for what they had built together. The legal battle lasted 2 years, involving lawyers and politicians and newspaper coverage that kept their story in the public eye. Jennifer testified before congressional committees about the rights of homesteaders and the importance of protecting small communities from corporate exploitation. In the end, they won. The mining company's claims were ruled invalid, and the settlers' rights to their land were confirmed by federal law. But the victory came at a cost, requiring legal fees and political lobbying that drained their resources and energy. Nate, 5'4" Lionel asked one evening as they sat on their porch, watching the sun set over the valley they had fought so hard to keep. Jennifer looked at the lights twinkling in the windows of their neighbors' homes, at the children playing in the twilight, at the gardens and workshops, and all the evidence of the life they had built together. "Yes," she said without hesitation, "it was worth it." She touched the scars on her face, feeling the familiar ridges and valleys that told the story of her journey. 7 scars, 7 stories of survival, and now countless more stories of the people who had found refuge in their valley. "Every scar tells a story," she said quietly, "and every story matters." Lionel took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers, as they had so many times before. "What story will tomorrow tell?" he asked. Jennifer smiled, feeling the deep contentment of a woman who had found not just love, but purpose. "Tomorrow will tell the story of a community that refused to give up, of people who chose to build rather than destroy, of love that grows stronger with each passing day." The stars began to appear in the darkening sky, and Jennifer counted them like blessings. Each point of light represented a life touched by their story, a person inspired to see scars as symbols of strength rather than shame. She had started with 7 scars and the belief that they made her unworthy of love. Now she had a husband who traced each mark with reverence, a community that valued her leadership, and a legacy that would outlive them both. It was more than she had ever dared dream, more than she had thought possible when she stood in that hotel room in Cedar Ridge, staring at her reflection and seeing only damage. The mirror in their bedroom still showed the same 7 scars, but Jennifer no longer saw them as flaws to be hidden. They were her history, her strength, her proof that she had survived everything life could throw at her and emerged not just intact, but triumphant. And in the morning, she would wake up beside the man who had taught her to see herself through eyes of love rather than judgment, ready to face whatever new challenges and opportunities the day might bring. 7 scars, 7 stories, and a lifetime of love ahead. It was enough. It was everything. It was home.